Okay, welcome everyone to the City Council meeting for the City of Larkspur for November 20th. Let's start with a roll call, shall we?
Councilmember Andre.
Here.
Councilmember Paulson.
Here.
Vice Mayor Way.
Here.
Mayor Candell.
I am here. Let's slide into number 2, which is let's do the pledge. Everyone stand if you can, please. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, thank you and welcome again. Let's pop into the second item, which is public comment. Public comment is for things not on the agenda. If you are here for something not on the agenda and would like to make a comment, now would be your chance. Please come on up and tell us what's on your mind. And seeing none, let me go online and see, is there anyone online that would like to make public comment at this point?
I'm looking for any raised hands from our Zoom audience members. And there's no public comment.
Okay, I will close public comment and go to the next item, which is presentations, which there are none. So I'll go to the next item. Approval of the consent calendar. Consent calendar are items that are non-controversial and usually ministerial. So first, let me ask, is there anyone on the dais here who would like to pull an item from the consent calendar for discussion? Is there anyone in the audience who would like to discuss an item on the consent calendar? Seeing none, is there anyone online who would like to discuss an item on the consent calendar?
Looking for any raised hands from the Zoom audience members. And there's no public comment.
Okay, with that, I will close the approval of the consent calendar for comment and ask if there is a motion.
I'll move the consent calendar to pass 3 items.
Second.
Okay, can I ask a roll call, please?
Councilmember Andre.
Yes.
Councilmember Paulson.
Yes.
Vice Mayor Way.
Yes.
Mayor Candell.
Yes. Item passes. Next item, City Manager's report. Mr. City Manager, what do you got?
Mr. Mayor, council members, members of the public, I just want to make sure folks are aware. We've been receiving a lot of public comments. I know the message is out there that tomorrow the Park and Recreation Commission meets in this room at 6:30. And the topic of the evening is a number of requests that the council received to allow dogs off leash in Piper Park in the mornings. And because that dogs off leash is written in the municipal code, the meeting tomorrow is so Park and Recreation Commission can make an advisory vote to you. You'll actually have to conduct a public hearing to make the decision ultimately on that matter. We encourage folks to participate either in person or online tomorrow. And then we look, all systems go that December 4 will be our transitional meeting, and we will swear in our 5th member. First time in a while, we'll have 5 members, and swear in our 2 incumbents who have been reelected. And then we'll try to keep that meeting short so that we can sort of enjoy that evening. We are planning on having a regular meeting on December 18th, and there are already items in the queue. So I want to make sure you're aware of that. And then lastly, for calendaring, we do not intend to have you come on January 1st and hold a council meeting. We are canceling that meeting.
Excellent. Okay, thank you for that. Next item is council members' reports. Any council member have items they'd like to discuss?
Sure. Just a couple brief announcements. So one is I attended our flood zone meeting on the 7th. And, you know, we are still part of flood zone 9. San Anselmo with their Measure F pulled out, but Fairfax, ourselves, Ross are in, and things are ongoing. So they're still planning to work on building Bridge 2, which is kind of a dam which wells up water and damages property upstream. But by opening that up, that would, possibly affect some Ross properties. But the question I always go with is what's going on for Larkspur. And, we've been part of the flood zone. I looked at my property tax statement. We pay for the flood zone. So I just really wanted to bring it up because I'm intending in 2025 to take more of a position there. And I'm just inviting the public and my, fellow council members to think about this because, flooding is is a real risk with extreme weather. And I think that it was very contentious, it's something that we've not really solved well. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. I'll keep you posted. The other is just, I'll just allude to it now, is for the meeting tonight, we'll be talking about traffic and traffic calming. I found, I went back to TAM, where I'm also a member, and found some very good studies. I'll be mentioning, any of the data there that may be relevant just in the questions more than anything else, because I found the county has taken a serious look at this issue too, and that might inform our discussion tonight. Thank you.
Since we last met, the mayor and I are your representatives to the Central Marin Police Authority and the Central Marin Fire Agency. And we met last Thursday. So just two highlights to let everyone know. With the Central Marin Fire, we finally finished the labor negotiations, or our managers finished the labor negotiations, and the board approved them. For the next 3 years, those labor negotiations have been approved not only for the regular staff and firefighters, but also the battalion chiefs. That's what we signed off on last Thursday. So that's great. Second report out is that with the Central Marin Police Authority, we approved the purchase of 2 all-electric pursuit vehicles that will be added to our fleet. And the plan is in the next years, I think it's a General Motors car, isn't it? The chief was waiting and had gone to a national Police Chiefs Association meeting, and we have been on a waiting list for a vehicle that I think a General Motors vehicle that has been specifically designed for law enforcement. And we are going to take ownership of those 2. And then our plan for the upcoming years ahead is to replace our fleet to electric. But that will also require that we create the infrastructure at the Central Marin Police Authority buildings for allowing them to be fully charged and available for use 24/7. So this is a big investment of our community into electric police vehicles, waiting for the right time to get the right type of vehicle. So that was interesting. And then the third thing is I'm our representative to the Sea Level Rise Countywide Committee, which is holding its first meeting this Friday. So it's a 4-hour kickoff meeting. But as soon as I learn more about what they're planning on doing countywide that Larkspur will influence Larkspur and Greenbrae, I'll be bringing it back to you. But I know many of our community in the last several meetings has expressed a lot more interest in getting involved in the climate resiliency and climate change conversation within Larkspur. So this Sea Level Rise Committee hopefully will allow us to do some of that. And that's all I have.
Stephanie, anything you'd like to? Okay, nothing today. The only other thing I want to just add on what Catherine said about the police vehicles, electric vehicles. The reason we waited also was there's a substantial subsidy that we were able to get. So we ended up getting them at a good price. And we are doing the infrastructure for, I believe, up to 20
Or 27. Or something like that.
between 20 and 30 vehicles is what we expect to have all electric over the next 7 years, I think the plan was. So I'm excited about that. Okay, I will now close that item and move on to the meat of our meeting. The first is a public hearing. Public hearing 7.1, City of Larkspur Community Facilities Director about the Larkspur Lagoon Bulkhead Replacement Project. Can we have a report?
Council members, members of the public, this feels very familiar because this is our second time going through this process. A reminder that the city has been in talks for quite a while with the Property Owners Association for the Larkspur Marina neighborhood. There is infrastructure that is private infrastructure with a public interest, which is what's called the bulkhead, the wall that holds the lagoon in place in that neighborhood. And after working with the Property Owners Association, it was felt that the best vehicle to empower the property owners to assess themselves and invest in the repairs that are needed for this infrastructure is to form a community facilities district. We already went through this exercise once, and unfortunately it was discovered after the fact that the assessments that were listed in the documents were based on property lines, and the property lines for many of these homes extend out into the lagoon and don't reflect the linear feet of the bulkhead or wall. And the intent was always that you would pay proportionate to the amount of wall that's on your property. So we rescinded the prior, you rescinded the prior process, and we're now going through the subsequent process to put that district in place and to empower the voters to, of that neighborhood to determine if they would like this to move forward. So this hearing is a necessary step in that process, and it's our understanding that it has strong support among the property owners in the neighborhood. And we would recommend that you move forward with the approval, much as you did with the prior documentation. And I know your municipal advisor, Mark Pressman's present, should you have any questions about the specifics of the assessments. Now I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Mayor.
All right, thank you. Question for, first, let me ask, does anyone have a question for staff?
Just one reminder question. When will this be brought forward to the Marina residents for voting on? Is that,
It's scheduled for a March 4 all-mail ballot.
okay? And we don't have, that'll be it alone on that ballot? Because I don't think there's anything, we don't,
I believe it's a special election just for that purpose.
Got it.
Yes.
okay.
Other questions from council? Okay, let me open it up to the public. Any questions or comments on this item? Come on up.
James Holmes, Larkspur. I have three questions relating to things that I read in the newspaper, and particularly the announcement in the Friday, November 8th, Independent Journal notice. There are just a couple of statements which I would like to have clarified, if you would. One says, also on October 16th, 2024, the City Council adopted its resolution 7424 declaring its intention to incur bonded indebtedness. So I wonder, is the city actually the bonded debtor as suggested by this text, which I can show you if you want. A second reference in the text states, if additional monies are needed to satisfy the annual special tax requirement, the special tax shall be levied proportionally on taxable public property at up to 100% of maximum special tax. So is there, in fact, public property of ours or anyone else's which is going to be taxed as a result of this? The third thing I read in the staff report states, city will disperse CFD bond proceeds to fund the cost of projects. So apparently we will actually be the fund holder. And so I wonder if we could get caught up in litigation if disputes arise regarding the disposition of the funds. And just lastly, I notice in another what would you call it, classified reference here, the announcement designing the project. It says there's a description of the project. This is the November 14th IJ. And it says prepared under the direction of Dan Schwartz, Larkspur Marina Financing Authority. So I mean, it's the same kind of thing that you would see for an actual real city project. So it would seem that we may be more closely involved with this as a bond debtor, as maybe someone being taxed, as a fund holder and disperser than anybody imagined, or at least as I understood. So I'd appreciate those clarifications. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, James. I'm going to wait until we hear all the public comments, then we can answer the questions. Are there other comments, questions, thoughts from the public on this issue? All right, let me turn it over to Zoom. Anyone on Zoom have a comment, thought, something you'd like to share regarding this issue?
Looking for any raised hands from our Zoom audience members. And there's no public comment.
Okay, I will close public comment. Let me, before I bring it back to council for discussion, let me see if we can address the issues raised by Mr. Holmes. I will probably kick it over to staff to handle these one at a time. The first, if you could, the question is, what is the city's responsibility as far as the bond goes? What is our recourse if there's if it comes back to us, if there's a default, what recourse do we have against the actual property holders? And what is our liability / litigation risk?
So the bonds would be issued by the Community Facilities District. So the references in the notice do reflect that the city council, once the CFD is formed, will sit as the board of the CFD. The CFD will issue the bonds. Mr. Pressman, I'm sure, can get into this in more detail, but the bond buying community will basically look to the city's creditworthiness to evaluate the bonds. But ultimately, the debts are only secured by the tax liens on the private property within the Community Facilities District. That's the way it's set up. The only recourse to bondholders is to those taxable properties and to the payment of the tax by the property owners or to foreclosure of the properties if the taxes aren't paid through the normal tax default process.
So hang on, Scott, let me just ask you a quick question on that so I make sure I understand it, which is if we issue the bonds, there's a default, do we get sued and we're indemnified by the property holders, or do they sue the property holders
I'm
directly?
going to cover the litigation
Oh,
issues
sorry.
in answer to the last question, but just to clarify, in terms of default, there should not be a default on debt service payments to the bondholders. And this in some ways goes to the second question to some degree, is that the way the taxes are structured within a CFD, it accounts for delinquencies by a property owner. And so there will always be adequate, any year that they levy the tax, there will be additional money available to pay debt service if there are a number of delinquencies by the property owner. So there should never be a point in time, based on the way a CFD is typically structured and the way that this one is structured, in which property owner delinquencies would result in a default on the payment of debt service to the bondholders. Now, that said, a property owner may well be delinquent, fail to pay their property taxes, which means that they would also fail to pay this tax. That would go into the normal tax collection and ultimately property foreclosure process, and the bondholders would have an interest in that. But since in most cases, most of the property owners will be paying their property taxes, and the way that the taxes are structured, there will always be enough money to pay debt service year to year. So city default on the bonds should not happen. And then in terms of litigation, we are close to finalizing an indemnification agreement between the Property Owners Association and the city, so that if there is litigation related to disbursement of funds, any other aspect of the CFD, the city would tender the defense of that to the property owners, and it would be their obligation to indemnify and defend the city. This is similar to the agreement that we already have with the Property Owners Association for the inlet or outlet gate project a couple of years ago.
All right. So, is there any requirement that there be insurance on the property? So hypothetically, there's a fire and all the properties get damaged, and now the value of the property no longer covers the amount owed or something like that. Is that kind of built into this?
The tax rate, as the city manager mentioned, is based on I think the linear feet of bulkhead on the property. So it's whether or not the value of the property itself goes up or down. The lien on the property to pay their portion of the taxes for the CFD remains in place and goes on year to year, regardless of the value of the property itself.
Right. But I guess my question is there a chance that the value of the property goes below the amount that is responsible by the property owner due to some, natural disaster, and all of a sudden they can't come after the property owners, so they come after the city?
There is no recourse under the bond structure to come after the city. Or if there is, the city would tender the defense of that to the Property Owners Association to defend. But again, if one property is damaged by fire, the property owner essentially walks away and declines to pay the taxes because the value of the property is diminished enough that they're not interested in rebuilding. the overall tax rates for the CFD and the structure of the reserves are such that there will always be money on hand to pay the delinquencies for that property. Ultimately, it would be defaulted, foreclosed, sold, and somebody would purchase it to develop a new house on it.
All right, any questions about those issues from council? All right, last a question that I would want answered is, Mr. Holmes mentioned that there was something about taxable public property. Could you explain
Yeah,
that?
I think Mr. Holmes was reading an advertisement for the Larkspur Marina Financing Authority, which is a different governmental entity. The primary purpose of that entity is to dredge Corte Madera Creek in the general vicinity of the Larkspur Marina neighborhood. It involves different houses than are being discussed here. It involves the homes that are on the outer part of the marina neighborhood and have docks, and it does involve some public property.
All right, so Mr. Holmes, we kind of closed public comment on this. Is there a question that you have? I see you've come back up to the podium.
I just think it was a factual, it's referring to satisfy the special tax requirement, shall first levy the special tax, and then the special tax shall be levied proportionally on taxable public property, is in the announcement relating to the bonded indebtedness as opposed to another advertisement. In other words, I was not reading another advertisement. I
Okay.
can show you the document.
No, it's not necessary. I appreciate that. I'm also
There-
going to just remind you, public comment is closed right now. So I appreciate that. If staff would like to respond to that.
That
you're-
advertisement was drafted by bond counsel. I suspect it's a template. There is no public property.
Okay. And Mr. Holmes, if you have any other questions, feel free to email them in and we'd be happy to address them, okay? Okay, back to council. Any questions, comments, discussion regarding this issue?
Feel like we've gone back and forth with it for a few different meetings, and I feel confident that it's cleared up now, and the language is cleared up.
Okay, hearing no comments from council, would anybody like to make a motion?
Yeah, I'll make that motion.
Would
I'll
anyone like
second.
to second that?
I'll second.
Okay, can we get a roll call, please?
Councilmember Andre,
Yes.
Councilmember Paulson,
Yes.
Vice Mayor White.
Yes.
Mayor Kendall.
Yes. Okay, motion passes. Going to the second public hearing, 7.2, Marin Sanitary Services Rates for garbage and recycling collection for 2025. Can we get a staff report for that, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. This is a public hearing you hold annually to consider the setting of rates for your franchise agreement with Marin Sanitary for the collection of solid waste, refuse, and recycling. In addition to the hearing on the rates and the request that you approve rate adjustment this year, there is an amendment proposed as we continue to work with our franchisor to ensure that we're operating our solid waste collection in compliance with the latest round of regulations that have been passed down through a number of bills, most notably Senate Bill 1383 and various directives from Cal Recycle. So we're fortunate to have online this evening the representative of the consulting firm that Larkspur, as one of the entities that works with Marin Sanitary, retains to analyze the rates and respond to questions about that analysis. The company R3, and we have Jim Howison and Libby Costello. I think Jim is here with us virtually to make a presentation.
Okay,
Okay,
welcome, Jim.
hey, thank you very much. If there is no objections, I'd like to share my screen and begin the presentation.
No objection, go right ahead.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
No.
No. Okay.
Not yet.
Let's see. How about now?
Yep.
Okay. As mentioned, my name is Jim Howison. I represent R3. And basically, I'm here with Libby Costello. We did the review of the MSS 2025 rate application. What we'd like to do is do a brief presentation basically describing the rate adjustment methodology, the rate compensation overview, the 2025 rate adjustment, a chart representing the rate comparison, and then open it up for questions and answers. So obviously, the first question is, what is actually a rate adjustment methodology? Let's start back and just say the reason this is all happening, it's not only because it makes sense to pick up your garbage, it is required by state law. And in this case, the city of Larkspur has contracted with MSS to provide these services. It's important to note that the rates we are discussing today are the sole compensation to MSS, so they don't get any government subsidies or anything of that nature. What you see on this screen and in the report that we submitted earlier is the compensation. The other thing that's important to note, that cost of services change every year. That includes labor wages, benefits, fuel, vehicles, government fees, processing, recycling. And it's also important and required because environmental programs like recycling and composting are actually more costly than doing landfill disposal. Let me go to the next slide. So we're still on the rate adjustment methodology. The annual rate adjustment funds changes in the cost. It is a contract between MSS and Larkspur. They kind of function like a CPI where they increase in relationship to inflation. But the way the contract is written, it is actually incentivize MSS to control their costs. There are two primary cost drivers within a rate application. One is what is defined as an allowable cost. These are costs which MSS is allowed a reasonable profit. And what we mean by that is they're allowed a 9.5% profit on those specific costs. And again, that includes salaries, trucks, overhead for accounting, human resources. But the important thing in this area is based on the contract, they're capped at 5%. So if their costs exceed 5%, they do not get compensated for that amount that goes over 5%. So what that means overall is for every $1 in billing, MSS is allowed a profit margin on 63 cents. So they do not make a profit on the whole dollar. The second cost category are the pass-through costs. And these include, and what happens with pass-through costs is they do not make a profit on those costs. And examples of those are the zero waste Marin fees, interest, franchise fees, things of that nature. In comparison to the allowable costs, for every $1 in billings, MSS is not allowed a profit on 37 cents. So pass-throughs, no profit, allowable costs, profit. So what is R3's role in the process? First of all, we are hired by the city of San Rafael on behalf of the 7 agencies in the Marin franchises group to review this application. What we do is review the application for completeness and mathematical accuracy. We ensure that the rate application is made in accordance with the terms and condition of the franchise agreement. And finally, we establish those findings and recommendations so that the council and the public are informed. So the rate compensation overview, the costs are breaking out in 4 different categories. Costs of operations make up about 64%. Processing, recycling, and disposal make up 13%. State and local compliance, 16%. And in the end, the profit allowance that is built within the rates is about 7.6%. So for 2025, after we reviewed the application, checked the math, checked it against the franchise agreement, the recommended adjustment is for 3.34%. It equates to approximately $1.70 on the 32-gallon subscription. Now, for the residents who need it, MSS does allow a 20% discount, and it's based on the PG&E care program. changes to the commercial rates is a little bit more difficult to calculate based on the size of the cart or the bin and the frequency of service. So we don't have a really good snapshot to show you that, but the 3.34 is applied to commercial just like it is the residential. So on a rate comparison, these, if you look at the dark blue are agencies that are outside of Marin Sanitary. The light greens are those rates that are basically managed by Marin Sanitary. Larkspur in the red is the third from the end. And if you take everything together, the average rate based on this chart is $57.18. And that is related to the 32-gallon residential rate. So at this point, I'd like to open it up for any questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that presentation. Appreciate that. Let me go to council first, see if council has any questions for the presenter or for anyone else, representatives of the company who I believe are here today to answer questions if we have.
Great, thank you, Jim, for the presentation. It's very helpful. I have a question about the vehicle impact fees. So is that a pass-through cost? And
Yes,
if that were reduced in any aspect, would that equate to a reduction in the, rate for residents?
that's a yes on both. It is a pass-through. Marin
Okay.
Sanitary does not make a profitability on that. And just like with any cost that is reduced would reduce the overall rate increase.
Okay, great, thank you. And I'm curious about the slide that says changes to the commercial rate. Changes will vary and can often be avoided through better recycling and waste reduction. So, do you have a study of what the commercial rates are versus other providers?
We don't actually have one ready for this particular presentation. If you want, we can do one and we can present it to you through the city manager, but we don't have one right now.
Okay, that's fine. I'm curious when I look at the memo, the report that was included in the staff memo. I'm curious to see how Larkspur, it looks like, from your bar graph, Larkspur and San Anselmo pay roughly the same rates on the 32-gallon residential. But when I actually look at the collector operations, and this is in the report that's attached to the staff report, collector operations for Larkspur are about 4.8 million, and for San Anselmo, it's 3.3 million. So if we're paying roughly the same rates, and the number of households Larkspur is a little bit larger, where we have like 1,000 more households than San Anselmo. What is accounting for the difference in the total collection number there?
So what happens with collections, there's many variables that come into play. Obviously, the number of customers you have, the type of roads, the ease in which the drivers can get out. Certain areas have what are called hard to service, that they take more time. And then you also have to take into account there's other costs that drive up that monthly rate that you're talking about. And that includes, the agency fees that you just mentioned, franchise fees. So when you look at the graph specifically, no franchise agreement, no agency is totally the same, because there are adjustments based on for the uniqueness of a particular community.
Right, I understand that, but I mean, even accounting for the agency fees, which are below, and we have higher agency fees than San Anselmo, it does look like, the collections for Larkspur are higher. Anyways, any sort of breakout of that collector operations number would be helpful in terms of categorizing how much of that is commercial or how much of it is basic versus all the ancillary fees. I'd also be interested in taking a look at how the ancillary fees compare versus other providers as well. It'd be
Okay,
helpful to see
I've
that.
made a note of that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Oh,
So just to piggyback on what Councilmember Andre was saying, an example would be, for instance, a community that had a large amount of hills and residences on hills that are difficult for the truck to access. And then they have an additional fee for that additional difficulty in accessing service, right? So it's harder to compare apples to apples for like one city to another city because of the geographic differences between the cities for pickup and access. Would that be an accurate way to say it?
That's correct. Like I said, every agency, every city, every county can be very unique.
Mhm.
And, you know, for example, like the vehicle impact fee has an impact. There's just a multiple variables that come into play, but definitely if it's hilly,
Right.
the hills?
I pay an additional fee for, because I'm on a hill.
Yeah,
So
yeah, that's common.
just trying to get the clarification that it isn't just city to city and household to household, that there are nuances for all the different ones.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I guess I'm, there's a lot here. It almost looks like you need a spreadsheet to follow this. So if Marin Sanitary is making like in the year that, just passed before this rate increase, if it were making 9.5% on the, 63% of costs, would that preclude it from doing a rate increase? If it's already got that profit margin? Or is it just that you can incrementally keep going up regardless of what the profit really is?
Right. So by contract, they're entitled to the 9.5, but each year their costs go up like everybody else's. They have labor agreements and stuff like that. And so what we're discussing tonight is basically an adjustment to those costs, which means automatically their profit is adjusted as well. But it's also important to note that within the agreement, let's say their costs go up 7%. They didn't, but let's say they do. They're capped at 5%. So they have an incentive to keep costs low. They don't want to go to 7 because they're going to lose money. They're going to lose 2%. So what we're doing is capturing those changes in costs year over year.
Okay, but let's just say, historically, for the last 35, 40 years, inflation was 2 to 3%. And that would allow you to do increases. I guess my real question is the actual profit. Like if we were to see something different here, like a profit and loss statement, there's no correlation to these rate increases to what's actually the bottom line on the profit and loss.
Correct. If you compare the two documents, correct.
Okay. So this methodology is, a bit of a regulatory, control of escalation of costs, but the actual operation, how much money they make, we have no idea.
Well, no, actually you do, because while you mentioned the income statement, what we actually do at R3 is take these numbers and we basically dissect them and understand them. So we understand that what their true profitability is what is defined in the contract, not what is defined on the income statement. The income statement for this purposes is actually irrelevant. It's what the contract says that they are entitled to a profit for.
Correct. So it's, so they have a certain entitlement, but if they were to keep costs low, that margin could grow year after year.
No, because whatever those, when I mentioned the allowable costs, whatever those costs go up or go down, their profitability is adjusted to that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And I think that, oh, yeah. And I think the thing that I've learned through the years doing this is that I think waste collection industry within California faces some of the most significant changes to their business model routinely as the legislature changes the rules about waste collection and as we learn more about recycling, as we learn more about trapping greenhouse gases and composting, the rules that the sanitary businesses go through to adapt to and to change are probably the most significant regulatory things that we get engaged with in making decisions. Plus, you add that not only the state of California, but the county of Marin is very progressive, maybe in say in waste management, but they put a lot of expectations on the sanitary haulers to adapt constantly to what the changing needs are of waste management as it advances. And I mean, I've seen how it's gone on over the years. Even the conversation we had a few years ago when we were in COVID and everyone was doing takeout containers for their meals, the amount of waste that the sanitary district had to process was remarkably higher than they had just the year before. And so, I mean, I think they have to be nimble and they are confined to how much profit they can make by law. But they have all these other regulations that are constantly being brought forward that they have to adapt to. So my 2 cents worth. And I interrupted you.
Well, I just wanted to follow up on Councilmember Paulson's question, because the increase or the profit, the stated profit is calculated off of their costs, but their actual receipts could exceed, right? What the actual receipts are not based on the costs. The actual receipts could include a whole lot of ancillary fees, step fees, hill fees, et cetera. And so how does that get trued up to the
So what-
actual profit that you calculate? Because the profit that you calculate is based on costs, but the actual receipts could be something totally different and could far exceed what the actual costs are. And so their actual profit could exceed what you're calculating here.
So that's actually a really good question. What happens is what you're seeing now is one of the rate adjustment methodologies that is used. There is a second methodology that is defined as a detailed rate review, where we actually do a much deeper dive into those and we review all the documentation concerning allocations, regulatory, and everything else like that. And so I believe in 2025, we're supposed to be going up to that kind of an analysis for Marin Sanitary Services. So in a year, you'll see a different type of presentation and a different type of report, but that is where we are truing up the costs in relationship to the profitability in relationship to the franchise agreement. So there is a true up mechanism that comes into play.
All right, I'm going to stop you for 1 second. I see the city manager has picked up the mic. Did you have a
Yeah,
statement or question or?
Well, Jim just answered part of it, which is that we're coming up with what the managers often refer to as a true up year, because we'll commission a much more thorough analysis, which is detailed in the methodology in the contract. For the benefit of the council members who weren't here in the prior decade, in the old methodology, there was a tremendous amount of rate volatility because true-ups were occurring pretty much every year. So we'd have a double-digit rate increase one year and no rate increase the subsequent year. So you'd have angry customers off the charts one year, and the next year everybody's thrilled. But over a 2-year period, you've kind of caused this certain average amount. All of the councils at that time were very frustrated with that methodology and instructed the staffs to work collaboratively with Marin Sanitary through a consultant, which ended up being R3, to create a new methodology that, one, created the incentive system that Jim's talking about. We wanted to incentivize the company to control its costs. But the second thing was we allowed that there would be probably annual rate increases, but they'd be predictable, modest increases rather than these radical fluctuations. That was something we had heard from the councils at the time, that they didn't appreciate that was happening every other year. So what I will do is I will pull up the old presentation and send you all out a link. I encourage you all to watch. There's a very thorough presentation of the transition from one methodology to the other that was made prior to it being implemented.
Great.
Thank you. Other?
Yeah, I
questions
just
or
I just
comments?
wanted to add that, I appreciate the question. And I think the the challenge sometimes is understanding, what I get out of the city manager's comment is that we have what seems to me difficult to understand, if not less transparent method, which, will create a certain amount of stability. I mean, 3.34%, I think any member of the public will think is a reasonable increase for a year. But I do, I'm more used to evaluating company operations based on profit and loss or something more transparent. So it's just been a little challenging to understand.
I think something Jim said has to really be kept in mind, and I suspect when and if you invite the company up there, they'll speak to this. Short of the city itself, this is probably the next most regulated entity that I deal with. And their regulations sometimes don't even last 12 months before they get changed. So some of the challenge of dealing with profit and loss sheets is you can build the best pro forma possible, and then the rules change on you before you get to the end of your fiscal year. And in this industry, that's just part of the challenge of doing business.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Other questions from council?
No, but in addition to the major review that's happening next year, I would also be interested in, a review of performance, just so we get an idea of, how things are going, with Marin Sanitary. I would appreciate, that being part of the presentation for next cycle. Thank you. And then one last thing I want to bring up, and this is probably doesn't have to do with R3, but it's in the staff report. There is a contract clause in here where the contract reads, it's I think 2.B. Anyways, this contract reads like a evergreen, perpetual type of contract where if we renew it this year, it extends for another 20 years. And so every year that we renew, this thing gets extended by 20 years. And I think I'd like to see if that can be renegotiated, or if not, then I would say that, we need to, in my view, I just feel like evergreen type of contracts don't really serve, they serve one side, but they don't really serve the other side. And I think there should be some compromise. And if we can come to a compromise on that, I would be interested in changing that part of the contract.
Okay, fair. Let me open it up now, but let me ask staff, would open it to the public or have the company come up and speak? What's the procedure at this point?
Well, when you open up to the public, you'll be opening the public hearing, and then you should allow the public time to
speak
make its
first.
comments and ask questions. So if you want to hear anything from the Marin Sanitary folks prior to that, now would be the time to invite them
Gotcha.
up.
Well, I don't have any specific questions for the Marin Sanitary folks. Okay, so I was going to give them the option. So I will now give you the option if you would like to come up and give a presentation.
Respect your time, and I'll try to be as brief as I can. But what I'd like to do first is address some of your questions and comments. And I will start with the comment that was made about the difference between San Anselmo and Larkspur. It's hard, very hard to compare the jurisdictions because of terrain. That's exactly it. And Larkspur also has a great deal more in the way of commercial accounts as well. We would welcome a performance review. We are very transparent and always have been. And let me step aside a little bit and do, I know we're in Larkspur, but I'll brag a bit about San Rafael does on odd years a citizen satisfaction survey, and we're always number 2, right behind fire and police. And my goal while I'm here is to make sure we get to number 1 one day, but fire and police have always been in that spot. Profit is not a guarantee. I think that's important to remember. While it's a pinpoint on the application, it is not a guarantee. And you're absolutely right. This organization, this industry is heavily regulated. At one point, I calculated that we are regulated by 27 different agencies, which is probably why my hair is the color that it is. It wasn't like this before I took this job. I'm actually a special education teacher. So with that, I just want to see if there are any other questions that I wanted to touch on. And we do have a short presentation, if you will. First, I'd like to introduce the colleagues I'm lucky enough to work with. Shannon Reaver is in the corner, and she is in charge of outreach here in Larkspur. So, and I hope you feel as though she's doing as great a job as I think she's doing. Justin Wilcock is our GM in charge of everything, including the charts that I'm going to show in a sec. Jason Raleigh is our CFO. So any other questions that you would like to ask of Jim or Jason, go right ahead.
And I'm sorry, could I just ask you also, when you came up, I'm not sure if you
Said who I am?
introduced
Oh,
exactly.
dang. Okay. So I'm Patty Garbarino. I'm president of Marin Sanitary, Marin Resource, and Marin Recycling. And our collective experience is 65 years. My father's not here. His is 73 years, but I'm president because my father is chairman of the board. Otherwise, I'm a special education teacher who started here 37 years ago. So some of the things that I want to do, most importantly, probably are, thank you very much, not on my behalf necessarily, but on behalf of the 260 colleagues I have back on Anderson and in between Anderson and Jacoby. And I would welcome anyone to come by for a tour, anyone from the public as well. See it, great. Because as I remember as a teacher, you remember 75% of what you hear, see, and do. I can't remember what the 100% is, but having a tour really does help show you what the operations are. These are generally the folks that do the processing and the sorting. We have a tandem picture that shows drivers. We'll bring that next time. The other important thing to note is that we had a Customer Appreciation Day on the 29th of September, where people came, took tours, they learned more, they got free compost, free shredding. This year, we actually had 526 folks come on a Sunday to do that. Last year, we had 201. And this is our 15th year, so we'll continue to do that. Our diversion rate remains the highest in the state. So yes, a performance review we would welcome, and any further suggestions. The compliance on our part is absolute. That's also part of my job, making sure that we're compliant, including with the legislation 1383, which is Herculean in terms of getting humid waste, any organics out of the landfill, which are, depending upon the science, 14 to 19% of the creation of greenhouse gases. We are actually looking at hydrogen vehicles. I was able to share with Gabe, I was lucky enough to go to Munich for 4 days in May and learn about the fact that the Northern Europeans are moving away actually from electrification because of the infrastructure and moving toward hydrogen. We're hoping to join a partnership with the Golden Gate Bridge District and Marin Transit and CMSA to be able to develop in that area, because we're all nearby, a hydrogen center production. So coming from probably the wood products that we process. Other carbon capturing that we're working on, in addition to our solar panels, are there has been a study on the ton per ton calculation of metric tons of waste that has been recycled, and what does that do for the climate? And it's a 27-to-1 carbon sink. So we're also very, very proud of that. And then finally, I have to show you this. I ran across the Landfill Harmonic Orchestra at the Canal Alliance. So these are young people who whose parents actually make a living by scavenging out of a landfill in Paraguay. And this wonderful man, an engineer, decided he didn't want to be a civil engineer anymore. What he wanted to do was work with children. And he realized that all of this stuff actually has a second life in addition to the recycling. So I don't know if you can see it from here. There are 8 children, and this is a viola, the strings of which are held onto the viola with a fork. So it's and next year they're coming back. They're gonna be back in our classroom for a week. And that'll be part of Customer Appreciation Day as well. The base broke on the way from Tamales to our place, and we were actually able to go into the indoor dump and get a piece of wood and fix the base. They sound absolutely like a professional orchestra, and it's a wonderful opportunity for them. Back in Paraguay, there are actually 250 students in their school. So with that, I'm done, and I'm so happy to be here and grateful for your support. Oh, yes, the renewable terms. Thank you so much. Back in 1990, when CARB dictated that you had to have any vehicle that was built before essentially 1990, eventually off the road in 10 years. We had 100 vehicles. Our culture is a family culture. We're a family-owned business run also by family and my colleagues. But we're an independent garbage company. But our culture is that of the community of Genova, which can be known for being stingy a bit. And we kept band-aiding all of the trucks. And now we were facing having to replace a fleet of 100 trucks in a 10-year span. And we needed financing. So by the year 2000, we converted or inserted that, or asked to have inserted that paragraph for renewable terms. And what the renewable term does is it gives us access to under prime loans from a bank because of the long-term contract that we have. So we also were able to calculate what that does at that time. So it's been a little while. It took $208,000 off of the rate, which was the savings then to the ratepayer. Now, if we blow it, if we do something bad, that is cancelable. So that goes away. It reverts down to a 10-year term, but it's not something that's fixed in stone. And the only reason we have it is for bank financing. We don't take home any more money for it. It simply gives us access. We're not Waste Management. We're not Waste Connections. We're not Republic. We can't finance off of stock. So it's a vehicle for financing. And there you have it. And I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation. Appreciate it. Let me ask, anyone on the council have any questions for Ms. Garbarino or anyone in her company? Yeah.
Hi, Patty. Thanks for being here.
You're welcome.
I heard, I think through the grapevine that there's a fourth can that we're going to need to get for recyclables. Is that correct? Or we're still 3 cans?
Well, that would be a surprise to me as
Okay,
well.
good. So urban myth.
Yeah, I don't think so. No,
Okay.
but I'll be checking at 5 a.m. tomorrow morning if there's a fourth.
I don't have room for more.
No, I don't either. So all good.
Yeah.
I'll check, Catherine,
Okay.
and get back to you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Great. I hit everything. Did you have something?
I
you
think
wanted?
that might be, so this wasn't covered in the presentation. I'm not sure if it's a
I
secondary.
referenced it. The amendment is in here. So
Yeah, so there is an adjustment where we're going to be allowing a secondary green can. And that might be where you're coming up with that fourth can. So that will be included in that the combined rate that customers can have up to a fourth can. And that might be so it's an option, but not a requirement.
And that would be for properties who have a lot of
Green-
vegetation
green waste,
that they
correct.
need to put there. Yeah.
Correct.
I sit on the Fire Safe Marin board also, and we've had lots of conversations about trying to figure out how to promote more use of the green cans for vegetation management on a regular basis so that every week they're full, by getting community members to really work at fire management and vegetation management in their property and to maximize their use of the green can for that every week.
We work very closely with them as well, and that was part of the reason why we decided going to biomass collection, further biomass collection, and hydrogen is where we would like to see us put our efforts. I also want you to know, and you'll see this when you come on a tour, most of our technology is based on a European model, a Northern European model. In Europe, especially Northern Italy, Southern Austria, if you have any organics, and that's where 1383 comes in, soon there will be fines if you have organics in your waste can. The first fine is 90 euros. The second fine is 150 euros. The third fine is 250 euros, and they take the cans away.
Mm.
So the world is getting very serious naturally about climate change and wanting to put those programs into.
Yeah, and I think we're probably also seeing that with the passage of the Marin Wildfire Protection Authority tax, in which there are yearly inspections of properties and a lot more vegetation management and removal of vegetation around homes, that you're probably seeing a lot more green waste that's coming through because of that. And that's been the last 3 years, I would assume. I don't know, I haven't seen the data, but I know there's a huge increase in homeowners removing vegetation that is fire prevention related. So thank you.
Welcome.
Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
Patty, thank you for your commentary on the renewable aspect of the contract. So is there room, I'm curious, to restructure it so that you are able to get your bank financing that you need, but that it's not perpetually renewing at the 20-year rate?
No. We've
So
gone
not
through
even the
that.
10-year
No,
contract
when,
would be
and
viewed
it's
as
simply a
long-term?
matter of, hello, bank,
Mhm.
we're going to adjust our contracts to be less valuable than they once were. So will you give us the same amount of loan at the same interest rate? And the answer generally is no. And we've called banks. We went through a great deal of pain to try to find that sweet spot where it wasn't going to cost anyone anymore. They're cancelable, but in their current state, they get us that financing.
Mhm.
And if there's a change to that, it jeopardizes our ability to get cheaper financing or financing altogether.
Mhm. Okay. And then could we look then at the termination clauses then, if it's going to
Sure,
be?
sure. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Then, maybe that's something that we do in terms of just, figuring out a structure that allows us some flexibility, but also gives you the ability to access the financing that you need.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Other questions or comments for Mr. Carreno? Nope. Okay.
Thank you.
Patty, thank you. All right, let me open this up to the public. Questions, comments? Come on up.
James Holmes, Larkspur. 3.3% is certainly better than 5%, et cetera. But one of my main concerns is one that was touched on by council members Andre and Paulson, and that is the 5-year look back. And my first question was going to be, why didn't we have the 5-year look back this year? Because the program was approved in the index program was approved in 2019. This is now the 5th year. And we should have had the look back this year. And as I recall, we were told last year that it would be this year. But lo and behold, the agreement now says that the look back period starts in commencing with the 2025 year. So I think we've already had 5 years, and this should have been our look back year and look back to actual year. And I wonder why we didn't have that this year. Looking at the R3 report, I see several items of expenses which are added into the rate increase, such as tipping fees, and they're based on partial year projections. But I saw no discussion of post-year adjustment to actual cost. By contrast, there is a specification or a specific item to adjust projected revenues to actual revenues, which was an excuse for a big part of the rate increase. But there doesn't seem to be an adjustment to actual for the expenses as opposed to revenues. For the increase item labeled database projection subscription, a rate increase was allowed, even though R3 says Marin Sanitary had no additional costs and in fact canceled its database subscription. For better transparency, I think R3's rate discussion should cite to the specific section and page that allows each rate increase, rather than just saying per Exhibit B. Exhibit B is 24 pages. Also, if Fairfax and San Anselmo now have the same index methodology, why aren't they part of the franchisers group? Have they discovered another and better, more rigorous way to review those rate increases? And finally, there was one item which was not covered in the staff report or the presentation, and maybe it's going to be a separate item, but it has to do with amending the agreement in two ways. Number one is to allow for the two cans. The second one is to require everybody use the green can. That is a proposed amendment. However, the description of services already provides for that. I'm looking at the page dated 12/6/2018, and it says only company provided tipper carts will be allowed for the weekly collection of compostable materials. So I see no reason why they are seeking now to add what is already in there. And I just hope that there is a greater precision with regard to the numbers than there is with regard to the text. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Holmes. Other comments, questions from the public at this point? Seeing none, I will go online. Is there anyone online that would like to comment on this item?
I'm looking for any raised hands from our Zoom audience members. And there's no public comment.
Okay, with that, I will close public comment. Let me first bring it to staff. I know Mr. Holmes had a lot of things. Are there any of those issues that staff would like to address at this point?
Jim, do you have any comments on some of the specific rate analysis?
Sure. Regarding the gentleman's question on why this year was not a detailed rate review, compared to the current practices, it's an option that both the city and Marin Sanitary has. The reason why it didn't occur was because it's coming up in a year. One of the things that should be emphasized with a detailed rate review, it's much more extensive, much more time consuming, and to be honestly, it's a lot more expensive to do because it is really a deep dive into the financial structure of Marin Sanitary. I know the gentleman mentioned the annual rate revenue reconciliation. That was part of the original negotiations, and the reason why that was put in there, if you remember earlier in the evening, I mentioned that there was a 5% cap on cost increases. Honestly, most cost increase caps that I see are 7, 8, 9%. And so what that annual revenue recognition is, it is actually part of the negotiation that allows Marin Sanitary to be compensated in accordance with the terms, because they did accept a very restricted 5%. So it's a bit of a compromise, but to be honest with you, and it's been brought up here, when you look at the 3.34%, it's extremely low compared to what we're seeing in the overall industry as a whole. I mean, I've seen rate increases in Marin outside of the Marin Sanitary jurisdictions, 9, 10, 15, 20%. So as Dan mentioned earlier, the process that has been put into place really has curtailed the rate increases for the citizens of Larkspur.
All right, thank you for that, Jim. Appreciate it. Jim, I have a question for you, which is in your limited audit that you're doing right now. My question is, can we rely on your statements to mean that Marin Sanitary is in compliance? Whoop, did we lose you?
Maybe we'll get him back shortly.
Let me ask.
Maybe I can help you in
staff.
this.
Yeah, my question is, can we rely on this to know that Marin Sanitary is in compliance with their agreement with us?
That is actually in the contract with R3. One of their requirements is to do that audit every year, is to make sure that the data they're receiving is compliant, and that specific questions they ask every year to make sure operations are compliant. Then in the larger exercise that will occur next year, they will do that on a larger scale.
Got it. But when you say compliant, I'm not talking about compliant with state law or anything like that.
Compliant with
Compliant with our
contract.
agreement. Okay.
And that's why you heard Jim several times say, you have to look at the agreement.
Okay.
Right. I did want to, there was one question I wanted to clarify maybe from Mr. Holmes. The franchisors group, and it's probably time for us to adjust that language in this staff report because we kind of recycle the staff report a little bit. The franchisors group is not a legal thing. It's a term that we use to recognize the 5 agencies that all joined in and had the same contracts with Marin Sanitary initially. And if you pulled off 5 of those contracts, they read substantially the same because they were all crafted at the same time. The adjustments are the things that came later. Councilmember Andre asked about vehicle impact fees, for example. That's a difference between Larkspur's agreement and, say, San Rafael's agreement. The 2 other entities, San Anselmo and Fairfax, they now sit at the table with us. It's seamless. We all act together in terms of asking our questions of Marin Sanitary and making sure that we are a regional partner. The difference is their agreements are not as old. They had a different provider about a decade ago, I think, is when the transition occurred. And there were some legacy elements that they wanted to carry forward into their agreements with Marin Sanitary. And actually took a while for the original franchisors to feel there was some fairness and equity in the distribution of certain admin costs and certain ways that we were recognizing amortization of various investments that Marin Sanitary had done. And so we've sort of gotten in the habit of, for a long time, we kept saying the franchisors group plus San Anselmo and Fairfax. But at this point, it's really one big group.
Okay, thank you.
I apologize. I lost connectivity and I just got myself back on. So, Mayor, if you want to finish your question, I'd be happy to answer.
The city was able to answer it for me, so no longer necessary, but thank you. Let me ask, is there any other comments or discussion council would like to have regarding this issue? Okay, hearing none. Is there anyone that would like to make a motion regarding this issue?
I'll move item 7.2, the Marin Sanitary Service rates for garbage and recycling collection for 2025.
Is there a second?
I will second that.
Can we get a roll call?
Councilmember Andre?
Yes.
Councilmember Paulson?
Yes.
Vice Mayor Way?
Yes.
Mayor Kendall?
Yes. Okay, with that, this item passes. That closes our public hearings. We now have 2 business items which we will discuss. But
Can I
first,
do
a
one
word
thing
from
really
our city
quickly?
manager.
I as the company leaves, I want to take a moment to let you know something, which is SB 1383 is a new world for all of us. It's the Senate bill that empowered Cal Recycle to begin to regulate this transition about organics and other items in the waste stream. It's important legislation, but it's challenging legislation, and it empowered an organization that really wasn't designed for the type of regulatory schemes it's now coming up with. I can't tell you how many times your staff gets confusing emails from Cal Recycle that require immediate response, and we have no idea what they're talking about. And we would be lost were it not for the very rapid attention that Marin Sanitary staff gives to these inquiries for us. And we're able to turn them around and make sure we haven't upset somebody up in Sacramento. So I just want to take a moment to really thank them. They are very quick in helping us in what could otherwise be a problematic regulatory situation.
Well, having heard that, let me, on behalf of the council and on behalf of the people of Larkspur, thank you as well. We really appreciate the cooperation and the partnership. Thank you. Okay, with that, let us move on to our 2 business items. First, Larkspur City Hall Facility Renovation Study. Can we get a staff report?
Good evening, Mayor, council members, members of the public. Julian Skinner, I'm the Public Works Director for the City of Larkspur. I have a short presentation regarding one of your capital improvement program projects. This is the project that proposes to complete a renovation study for Larkspur City Hall. And the question before you tonight is in response to some public comment that was received, if we should add some public outreach to the study that we're doing. So as you recall, you awarded a contract to Page and Turnbull for doing a renovation study of City Hall, and we have members of Page and Turnbull with us in the audience tonight. In case there are questions about the historic structures report, they've done way more of them than I have. And then we also have our project manager Kitchell available on Zoom. So we came to you in September. We gave you an update on Page and Turnbull's progress on the historic structures report. There is some outreach included in the Page and Turnbull scope of work. Again, this is outreach for the historic structure report. This is not outreach for City Hall renovation at large in the future, but we did work some public outreach into the contract because we anticipate this historic structure report will be a part of the conversation in the future of what happens with City Hall. So we didn't want to do that document in a vacuum. We wanted to share it with the public and have the public have an opportunity to provide some feedback and some input on that historic structures report. So the first public touch point was that September council update. And then we had one public workshop that was planned that we were initially looking at doing before the end of this calendar year, but it's been pushed out now to probably late January, February. And then there will be an additional council update as we get close to the end of the historic structures report. And as I mentioned, we did get some feedback from the public that they were interested in having some more public engagement during this study process. So this is the Page and Turnbull contract. These are their deliverables working from left to right. They've done the site visit. They did a research of documents on the history of the building and documented that. And then the two middle sections here is the meat of what their scope is. It's a historic structure report. The first part of it that's pretty much complete is a conditions report. That details everything in the building and the condition that it's in, both structurally and its historic significance. And then the second part of the historic structure report is if you were to upgrade the building, what does that look like based on the condition and the historic aspects of the building? So those two parts comprise the historic structure report. And then once we have the second part, which is looking at how to improve the building, then they will do some cost estimates based on the cost of updating the building. And then I have in red here the public touch point. So there was one early on, a city council update. Then there will be one near the end when we have the draft HSR complete and we want to bring it to you as a draft. And then we have this public workshop that kind of spans the HSR. And so that public workshop allows the public to give feedback on the part one, which is the conditions. So the architects will present kind of a map of this building and they'll show what are the historically significant components of the building and talk about some of the condition issues with components of the building. And then for the part two, they have to do cost estimates for renovating the building. So in their analysis of the condition of the building and looking at what the codes are, they will know what it takes to upgrade a building so it will last 50 to 100 years. And then one of the issues with doing that for this process is we know that the library downstairs is going to move out. So if we're going to renovate this building to last another 50, 100 years, we're not going to renovate downstairs to be a library again. It's going to be something different. And so they need something to base those cost estimates on. And so we'll be looking for public feedback on that. It's not a decision on what happens to this building in the future. There are just different code triggers and there's different costs associated with how this building is configured in the future. And they would like to hear from the public about open space downstairs, open space upstairs, office space downstairs, upstairs, just kind of things like that, something to base those cost estimates on. So that's a public touch point. But again, it's not, we're calling that the configuration and the layout of the building and not really the use. That's part of a future conversation. And so as I mentioned, Page and Turnbull determined in putting their scope together that the public outreach that would be required for them to complete the historic structures report would be those couple of meetings, informational meetings at city council meetings, and then the one public meeting that's anticipated to be more of a charrette where we'll have some different stations and we'll be able to have some displays on the structural components of the building, the historic components, and then, you know, a couple of cartoon diagrams of what the building configuration could be in the future. They did look at their scope and what it would take to add some additional public touch points in this process. And so if we were to hold another one of those same types of meetings and have the preparation for the meeting, hold the meeting, and then take the results of the meeting and fold it into the historic structure report, you're looking at about 25,000 for each one of those additional touch points. And again, their contract includes the one public workshop and the 2 council updates. So if it was determined that we wanted to add additional public outreach into this HSR document, it would require amending both their contract and the overall project budget and the CIP. Because as a reminder, in your capital program, you have funded doing the study for the building condition. You haven't funded looking at future building use and whatever the next steps would be in the process. So the options that we're looking for direction from you tonight is if you would like us to add some additional public outreach as part of the historic structures report. It was also suggested that we add additional workshops beyond 1 or 2 to the point where we fold in the future use of this building as part of what the Page and Turnbull scope is. That's typically not what's done with a historic structures report. And the consultants have advised that the best path forward is likely to complete the historic structure report and use that as part of one of your tools when we discuss the building use in the future. That way you'll have this technical document and the costs, and then we can set that in the context of all the public outreach that we would want to undertake as part of the discussion as to what happens with this building in the future. So then your fourth option is to keep the scope as it is. And then once everything is complete and we have this historic structures report, then we can start with the conversations of now we have this document and let's look at the other pieces that we would need to bring together in order to move a project forward to look at the renovation of this building. So that's my quick report. I'm available for any questions. And again, we do have members of Page and Turnbull here if you have any technical questions also.
Okay, thank you, Julian. Appreciate that. Let me put it to council for questions for staff for Page and Turnbull.
Julian, so the options that you listed in that last slide is 1 public workshop or 2 public workshops. And then it had 3 months and 6 months. Is that anticipated that it would occur over a 3-month period of time or a 6-month period of time? I didn't understand what that differential was.
So sorry, yeah. So that was the schedule impact.
Okay.
If we add another workshop,
It'll
it
be
will
6
push out the
months.
final document by 3 months. If we add 2, it'll push out the final document by 6 months.
Okay. So that's just clarification.
Thank you. Other questions from council?
Yeah, thanks for that, Julian. I'm trying to frame this in my mind as, you know, the deliverables really are in 2 steps. You know, the conditions report is really engineering based and the public input there was, you know, again, the parts of the building that will need to be preserved or historical. And then the improvement recommendations is secondary. So I think my sense is the need for public input would be on the second deliverable. And I'm wondering a couple of things. You know, first, you know, Page and Turnbull has been doing this very, you know, technical architectural side. When it comes to outreach, is that something that they're most suited for? I mean, I imagine that the 2 deliverables overlap because if you want to talk about improvement recommendations, you probably have to refer back to, you know, the conditions report. But is that possibly a separate effort, you know, that isn't an extension of the current contract?
So, yeah, that would be, the recommendation of Page and Turnbull is as they structured their scope, they have the public outreach that they proposed was specific to completing a historic structures report. And they have said that they can add a couple of similar type workshops at the cost and duration extension that have been prepared. The reason the third option, which is add sufficient public workshop to arrive at what is the future use of this building, has a to be determined, because that requires a whole other conversation, and maybe it does require some outside help in doing some of the public outreach that we don't need to go to that level just to do the historic structures report. So yeah, if we want to take that beyond just adding the public outreach for the HSR, then we would have to come back and look and chat with Page and Turnbull about other companies that they've used in the next phase of projects when they've done this and they've gone on to the next level and there's a bigger community effort. That's why we haven't provided a cost for that option.
Okay, and just one last question. Could you say a little bit more about the improvement recommendations? Because that's something I've been really curious about. So specifically, I imagine there's kind of a facility feasibility constraint, like, hey, you could never use this for office because it doesn't, it would be prohibitive. Or I'm wondering what the range of options and parameters are, based on the conditions report and sort of the technical side, because there's a certain amount of public imagination and a certain amount of public interest that's needed for us to even move forward with this. And I'm still trying to get a feel for this unknown.
Yeah, it's not so much use. We're not trying to lock in the use of the building with the historic structure report. But as I mentioned, the main issue is we're not renovating the building to its current configuration because we're not going to spend all of that money and rebuild a library downstairs. So in order to do the second part of the HSR, they need to plug something into that space. And then that needs to go through the cost estimating process for what it would cost to renovate this building to 50 years. And it's not so much the use that's going to differentiate those costs. It has to do with how much open space and gathering space and meeting room. There are certain triggers in the code that, for example, could require the building goes to a next level of structural improvement. So one of the things they're going to look at is, I think we've heard before the city needs more meeting space. And so one of the things they're going to be looking at is how much more meeting space could we get in here before we trigger a different level of structural improvements. I think if you're doing the 50 to 100, you're probably doing those anyway. That's more in the short term. If we're looking at a shorter term project in the 10-year, if we're looking at the 10-year and you want to build a auditorium space downstairs, but that's going to trigger the code requirement to doing a complete retrofit, then that's drastically going to affect the cost. So they just kind of want to get some public feedback, and they want the public to participate mainly so that when this document comes back and it's part of the conversations in the future, the public's not seeing it for the first time and asking, how come there's 10 offices shown where the library is, or how come there's a big open space? And we're not locking those in. We're just doing it for the purpose of generating that cost estimate, kind of a starting point to build off of in the future. And there'll be some options in there when they do the costing. We'll know, if it's a deduct or an add, if this were to be open space or offices, thereabouts.
Okay, I mean, because I'm concerned that public input could drive what they look at for improvements, but we could get a whole range independent of what the public asks for. I mean, we could say, look, regardless of what the public wants, you can only go from 1 to 4, and these are all the costs, and these are all the triggers for higher costs and so forth.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
the HSR has to have some conceptual design in order to generate that cost estimate, and we should consider that a starting point. It'll be a number, it'll be a reference number, and then as we go through the public process and we start talking about what the building could be and how it could be configured, we'll know if we're looking at something that's above that number or below that number, depending on what that use is. It's basically going to set a benchmark for costs when we get to what is the building use in the future. It's not meant to lock in. We did this report for this configuration and that's what we're going with moving forward.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Andre, questions?
Great. Thank you, Julian. So if I understand you correctly, then we've hired Page and Turnbull to issue a two-part report. So the structural report and then also the improvements. Is that, we've engaged them for
Correct.
to do a two-part type of report. Okay. And so right now, they're recommending that the workshop happen in between so they can issue the conditions report first, and then we do a public workshop and then the recommendations. Am I reading that correctly?
So it'll overall be released as one document and there's two parts to it. And so what the
Okay.
workshop proposes to do is share with the public the
Uh-huh.
draft of what the conditions report would look like. So we will share with their analysis of the history of the building, the historically significant parts of the building, and then the conditions. And then we'll be looking for feedback from the public if they have any thoughts on, well, why isn't this significant, or other things that they think maybe we didn't look at in that analysis. So it's an opportunity for the public to provide feedback on that condition and historic analysis before it gets finalized into the document. And then the other part of it for the part two is we would like to hear from the public,
Right.
more meeting space. No, I always thought there would be city offices upstairs and the council chambers would be better downstairs.
Mhm.
That kind of feedback.
I see. Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Okay, Catherine, turn your mic back on. More questions?
No, I don't want to throw out controversy right now.
All right, I have a couple questions. First is, why is it $25,000 for a meeting? I mean, I'm an attorney. I charge a high hourly rate, and yeah, it's not gonna be $25,000 for a meeting. So what's going on?
Yeah, so it's not a meeting. It's not just a meeting. It's all the preparation for the meeting. It's the meeting itself, and then it's the downloading of what's in the meeting and converting that into part of the document. So it's not just the meeting.
I understand.
There's a lot of preparation, and that's your not to exceed amount, so it may not be that much.
So
but-
if we cancel that one meeting, do we get $25,000 off our agreement?
Well, no, because we've already started some of the prep work for the one meeting. So yes, you would save some money if you didn't want to have a public outreach meeting at all, but we've already started doing some of the prep because remember, we were planning originally on holding it in November.
Right. So I guess where I'm struggling is that public input is very important on this. Okay. As far as what is this building going to be? Okay. But that's not what that meeting is about. The meeting is about what is your report going to look like? And it seems that we as a council could very easily say, hey, just give us 4 options. Have an option with it as an open space. Have it as an option with offices. Have it, and then it would be really valuable to have the public say, hey, you know what? Here's the prices for each option. What do we want to do with this building? Because that's really the public.
Mr. Mayor, you're describing phase 2.
I understand, but my question is, I'm not seeing the value of a public meeting for phase 1 when we could just say, just give us the options. I mean, the public's going to get there and they're going to do the same options anyway, and we're just burning money. I just don't understand.
So the consultants can jump in and stop me if I'm wrong. I use this example a lot. If you go back to the council meeting where you heard your first presentation, I was surprised to hear that the children's room is not historical at all. And so one of the purposes of the preliminary engagement meeting is to identify items like that and say, even though it's not historical, does it matter to you? That's the kind of questions that will help inform for phase 1.
But can't we just give options? I mean, there's not that many variables. The downstairs is not that big. We can
Well,
say,
I'm
keep
getting
this
a
room,
mixed,
don't
I'm
keep
getting a
this room.
mixed message, Mr. Mayor. I was under the impression, the instruction to staff was to do public outreach. And we think this is a really important component of public outreach. So I do value it. I've listened to the project team and I actually want to defend the $25,000 price. They have to prepare engineering and architectural renderings for each of these meetings. So you have to understand it's not prep for a meeting. It's preparing a lot of diagrams and paying experts to keep generating them when the goal is ultimately to fuel this one report.
I get it. And if I'm in the minority, so be it. But my feeling, and again, I'd like to hear from the public on this, but my feeling is if we're talking about the downstairs,
So-
hang on, there's just not that many, options that we should be able to say, hey, give us these four options.
So here's the question I would ask you,
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor. The current program, the current plan is to engage the public in phase 2 so that when I say to Councilmember Paulson, do you like this idea? It costs $6 million more than that idea. He gets to think about whether it's worth $6 million when he renders his opinion. We can't do that if you don't have this report.
But why can't you have that public outreach after you have the report? And then it comes to Mr. Paulson here and Councilmember Paulson, and he says, let's talk to the public about it.
Because before you have the report, what we want to hear from the public and key stakeholders is these elements that have been identified as historical and these elements that have been identified as not historical, that doesn't mean they don't all matter to people. And we have to get a general sense of that. And that has nothing to do with whether council chambers end up on first floor or second floor. It has to do with what is the footprint and the look and the feel of this building for the next 100 years. And I think we owe it to people for whom that matters a lot to give them the opportunity to give that input to the consultants as they prepare this report.
Okay.
So this is kind of how I look at it, Scott, just because thinking about it, it's two phases. The first is the history and physical, this is the nurse in me talking, history and physical, and we need to get that data, that information, the history of this building, the history of what it was used for, and then the physical assessment of what its challenges are and everything else. And then phase 2 is you come up with the treatment plan, you come up with what your options are for what you're going to do with it, which is going to require a lot of public engagement because there's a lot of emotion and a lot of feeling about that. And I think we definitely have to have that workshop period of time.
I agree.
But to the city manager's point, I think there are still a lot of people vested in our community as to the history and the physical nature of this space. And they want to have an opportunity to weigh in about not just what the facts are, which the Page and Turnbull can get through all the architectural history, et cetera. I've read all these RFQs for I've read 11 of them so far. And it's a really interesting document that can be built together to show the history of this building and its space that it occupied and the things that it did over the course of the 110 years. And people may weigh in of how they experienced it when they were engaged here in 1972 or whatever. And I think it's a valuable part. But I think the real key is going to be once we get the information, the H&P, the history and physical, what are we going to do with this space?
I guess
and how much it costs?
I'm with you. My only thought, and I don't want
I
to
know
discuss it because I want to open it to the public, but my thought is if we have X number of dollars, I think that money is better spent afterwards when those meetings are really going to matter, when we're like, what do you want to do with this building? Now you have more information. Here are the costs if we want it to be this or this, and how do we want to handle it? Those are going to be crucial. And I just
But I think that's
I
why
hear what you're saying, and
I think that's why Julian gave four options: one workshop, 2 workshops, or save them for the phase 2. But I think it's important now that there are a lot of people who are passionate about this who want to speak. So
let's with that, let's open it up to the public. If you have something to say on this item, come on up. Yes, sir.
Good evening, council members, Mayor Dennis Gilardi, Larkspur. We've been talking around in circles. This building, being 110 years old, was built by a group of women who took the responsibility away from the men who are trying to run the city and say, we need to build this building. Why? Because it then define where 101 was going to be, otherwise the main road, with the vision that there was going to be a bridge eventually. It was built as the city facility. The plans for this building, albeit historical, and Page and Turnbull can give us a lot of input as the current status. This top floor was an auditorium. It's very apparent in looking at it's available. The downstairs had the sheriff's office or the constable's office and some administrative offices and the fire department. And the children's library was the fire department. It's on the plans. It's very easy to see. It's not a surprise. What I can tell you, the citizens or members of our community want to do is to get a current condition report and then have an opportunity to discuss what are we going to do with this building. A year plus or so ago, Dan Schwartz lobbied to get rid of this building and replace it, sell it, do something. It's an historical building. It's a fact. It's under historical rules. We're not going to change unless we have some real good reasons, the structure of the building, the outside, the external structure, which is going to continue to reconfigure part of the inside of the building. It is the main public building. It is the gateway to Larkspur. It does house our city administration. It's, in my opinion, as a potential office building, which it is, it can house our city employees who live and work in apartments, or not apartments, but offices today. Last time I looked, the city manager has 12 people on his staff working in this building, not counting the library. Public Works has got another 8 people in offices. This building, 10,000 square foot, could easily house 20 employees. And it has in the past. All the services to our citizens have been kept or were in this building for many, many years, most of my lifetime. And I think the idea of the Page and Turnbull report was fantastic. And I look forward to seeing what they tell us about the current physical condition of the building. I want to see what's going to play into the fact that these windows were replaced. Foundation work was done. Termite work was done. This second floor has been remodeled a number of times. That's a false ceiling. There's all sorts of opportunities.
So,
But it's first and
Dennis,
foremost, it's a building that the public recognizes as the gateway to Larkspur. It's an important building. It would be like saying, let's recycle St. Patrick's Church and make it something else. That's a non-starter. It's the city hall.
No, Dennis, but the question on the table today, we're going to have the public meetings about what should we do with this building and everything. The question is the public input after the draft to give public input on the creation of the report. And what I'm taking from what you're saying is that you would find that valuable. You would like to have an opportunity to give input to Page and Turnbull after their initial report before their final draft, because that's the question.
After the initial report of the condition of the building. That's what's been presented to us for the last year plus. We've been hearing it's not earthquake proof, it's not this or that. I've heard for years the elevator. Well, we have buildings in this country that have elevators that are over 100 years of age that work.
But no, but hang on, I just want to get your opinion on this because, it's important, which is the question that we are asking today. Okay, all the things that you're saying, I agree with. The question is that we're going to get a preliminary Page and Turnbull report, and they're going to say, okay, here's some of the things that you're talking about. Before we do our final report, we want to know some input about what the public thinks. For example, the downstairs, should it be an open room? Should it be offices? Things like that. And the question is that something that you would want to participate in at that early stage and say, hey, when you draft your final report, I'd like an option with an open downstairs?
Not really, because here, look, at this point in time, I would expect Page and Turnbull can answer the initial questions. What's it going to cost to make this a 5-year or 10-year or 20 or a 50-year fix? It's all hand grenades. And we know that the numbers, actually Novato is going through this process right now, trying to save their city hall and renovate it. So it's a given. We'll be talking $1,000 a square foot to do this or that. The use of the building is not something that the public, I think, needs to debate. They just want to know what the cost is going to be. To keep this as an office building, regardless if you add another meeting room or whatever, just to bring the basic upgrades of the HVAC, the electrical systems, the rest of the earthquake preparedness, that's a number. That's not going to change. And that number, if it comes out to be this big, we all might step back and say, we got to rethink this. If it's a different number, then when we have the public meeting about how much money do we want to spend, do we want to have a special little historical room downstairs to recognize the fact the council chamber is down there originally, and spend the money? No, it's a practical office building. So I look forward to seeing the report and the details that came up with the analysis and using the technology of today to scan the walls and everything else.
So Dennis, it sounds like from what you're saying that you would find that the public outreach, the public workshops would be more valuable in phase 2, which is when we actually have the substantive report, and engage really robust public discussion about what the future of this building is once we actually have the data.
And we have the cost.
And we have the cost.
The cost, yeah.
So do you see any value in having any in the initial part where there's, we're doing the engineering and seismic look and everything else that Page and Turnbull is doing? Would it be valuable to have a workshop during that phase, or that's just going to be redundant?
I'd like to know what they found.
Yeah. Okay. So
Okay.
part 2.
This building is, built with virgin redwood,
lumber.
true 2x12s. It's typical of a number of buildings in Larkspur and in our North Bay area that have been through numerous earthquakes. And it's got good bones. What does it take to bring this up to current standards without trying to get in to trigger all the new code requirements? And that could be a real deal breaker with all new building codes. Or we can approach this as saying, look, it's an existing building, it has no parking. Its purpose is to house the employees of the city of Larkspur and the council chamber. That's its purpose. Let's leave it at that. Because we're never going to tear this building down, and you're never going to find anyone that would want to buy it because it has no parking. However, even with a lack of parking, there's never been a real problem with meetings here because the capacity in this room is relatively small. In the past, if we had overflow meetings for many, many years, we went across the street to St. Patrick's, then down to Hall School when we built out that meeting space in the gymnasium. So I think the public is more sensitive to what's it going to cost to keep our city hall than what it's going to be used for. And I think to digress to say, give the public an opportunity to start looking at other uses, everyone will come up with 1,000 different ideas. But if you do come to a point and say you want more meeting space, where are you going to park the people to come to the meeting?
All right, hey, Dennis,
We're going
appreciate
around
it. Thank you.
circles. Thank you.
Thanks for your thoughts. Other comments on this issue?
Joan Lubomirsky, Larkspur. Good to see you all. The main point that I want to talk about is public information, public outreach, TikTok, Instagram. The city's Instagram is there, I know, but it's not very lively. And I think that there needs to be a way, and I don't think that historic architects and engineers know how to do this. I think Councilmember Paulson kind of talked about different skills. And Mr. Skinner said something about that too. But I think that any 25 or 50 or whatever $1,000 it might be would be better spent on people who know how to reach the public. Because otherwise, there's going to be very few people who even know that we've got to talk about the children's library or not, or that, this, or should there be
So
a
Joan,
council?
Let me ask you the same question if I could.
Yes.
So I just wanted to ask you the same question, which is, would you like to be part of the discussion in the preliminary stages? Before we have a preliminary report and they're like, well, should our final report have a big open space downstairs or offices downstairs? Do you think that would be valuable for you to have a preliminary presentation, give your input before the final report? Now, that preliminary part won't have any prices or anything like that. It's just to get ideas.
Well, I think the historic structures report should include options for what possible uses could be here. But again, back to public information, if, Dennis and I and Joan Lundstrom are the only one who know these meetings are happening, then that would really be sad, because one of the points in the staff report that's made is there needs to be community acceptance of the decisions. And so I think that it's just going to be very important, like I said, whether it's, the mayor doing a TikTok thing, which TikTok is fun. I mean, you can get lost in it. But I think that if we did have a website, if we did have a sign in front of City Hall saying, let's learn about City Hall. I think that that is really, really important, because otherwise, unless the public knows, they're not going to be prepared to support whatever you do. And the other thing is, I think there should be some sort of a community advisory committee on this. The library public effort went on for years and years, and we all support that. And I think this is a capital improvement. I mean, it's not the library, but it's City Hall. And so I think that kind of attention would be warranted. And I don't think that there's any rush. I think that there's time on this, and I'd be happy to participate in any way going forward.
Thank you.
Sure.
So Joan, just to clarify, it sounds like more, I mean, I get your communication with public is always a challenge to get through the void. But it sounds like of the options that were presented by Mr. Skinner about public workshops in phase 1, which is just getting the historic report, just getting the data on this building, would not be as valuable as really having robust public workshops in phase 2, which is, what are we going to do now that we know the pros and cons and the limitations of this space?
But talking about a robust meeting or
Yeah.
charrette or something is empty unless we have a way to let people know about it.
Okay, well, that's
So,
always
thank
a
you.
challenge in this,
No,
in
no,
this
I
whole-
understand, but I mean, I
getting
think
people to
there are
show
ways
up
to
and
do
pay
it.
attention
Thank
and
you.
participate's always hard.
Okay,
So-
but I'd be happy to. I mean, there are civic engagement firms who do this, and some that are local that might be willing to participate to give us ideas besides my Instagram idea. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, other comments, public comments on this item? Come on up. Three's a charm.
James Holmes, Larkspur. I admit to being a little bit confused on what the current contract provides for by way of public input and workshops. I certainly haven't read it as closely as I did the garbage one. I'm a little bit unclear in terms of whether the workshops would follow. There'd be one that follows part 1 and one that follows part 2. Generally speaking, I think that the one that follows part 2 is the big production. There should be something, though, related to part one, and that should get some attention, and maybe that's something considerably less than $25,000 than we would spend for part two. I also think just 2 points. Number one, I think that the amount of public input and workshops depends on kind of the response you get with the initial one. If there's a lot of public concern and distress, you want to have more public input. Number two, please don't underestimate the ability of your staff to conduct some of these meetings. I can remember with the Citizens Advisory Committee on the General Plan, we had a consultant who was handling the meetings, and he was fired because Neil could do a much better job than the consultant did, much better. And I happen to know, because I've seen her, your current planning director is just terrific in handling meetings. So whatever you do, I know they have lots of other things to do, but please don't underestimate their ability to conduct some very successful workshops. And finally, yes, I think you should give some thought to the kind of information that Joan provided with respect to alternatives for providing information relating perhaps to the first hearing.
Thank you. Other comments from people in chamber? Seeing none, let's go online. Anyone online have a comment on this issue?
Looking for any raised hands from our Zoom audience members. And our first comment will come from Joan Lundstrom.
Good evening, Joan.
Joan number 2. Speaking directly to why at this point you need public input. I look at the cost estimate is going to be based on also what the public thinks, because I'm quoting Julian Skinner in the September 27th Marin Jay, who said, "We want to make our cost estimates based closely as we can on what we think the ultimate use of the building is going to be." And that's the broader standpoint. And maybe I don't even agree at this point that it should be, this is going to, as Dennis Gilardi said, going to be all offices. I'm not assuming that. I think we need to hear at this very early stage, for 2 reasons, a number of options that we haven't even thought about, and that people have their hearts set on, and it's not just consultant driven or staff driven. We need that broad input, and it's not as narrow as what goes on in the first floor or the second floor, because we have to think structure wise, and that's where the public needs the input of Page and Turnbull, what they have seen. And I think at a minimum, you need 2 workshops, not the one. The one workshop, you don't need, oh, by the way, on agenda number so-and-so in January, February, we're going to get together, and it needs a very broad informational outreach, because as a matter of fact, we're all going to be designing a building that's going to stand here for another 100 years. This is a major structural building from the city standpoint, but also from the historic downtown standpoint. So you need this early input now. So I'm arguing for public input now, because it does have an effect on the cost estimate. Maybe some interesting point might be made that we haven't really thought of, but also for the very real point that this is it needs public acceptance because of the cost, and the cost from where the money will come from. So maybe we would go for some grants. Maybe we'll have to go to the public for contributions. We don't know, but to build that, I think it will take at this time in phase one, another workshop, because the first one will raise questions and comments, and it should be followed up by the second one. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other online comments?
I'm looking for any additional raised hands from our Zoom audience members. And there's no further public comment.
Okay, with that, I will close public comment. Is it possible to ask some questions from somebody from Page and Turnbull? Could you come on up and
Is that on?
uh,
Hear me?
yep, here
Yep.
you're fine.
Great.
Thank you.
City
Um,
Council, thank you for having us here. So I'm Carolyn Kiernot. I'm a principal at Page and Turnbull. This is my colleague, Elisa Skaggs. She's the project manager. She's really been leading the effort to have the building assessed and to put repair, restoration, structural recommendations together. So yeah, we're here to answer any
Well,
questions.
thank you for being here.
Absolutely.
I have a question which I'm just not feeling comfortable with the answer yet. Hoping you can help me. We're going to end up with a report, which is going to say, hey, here are some options of what you can do with the building. This is what it would cost you, things like that. I understand there's a question of what that final report is going to look like and some potential public comment that would help steer you. I guess what I'm unclear about is how many options are we really talking about that if you get the public together and, could you anticipate I mean, it sounds like what I heard is there's some maybe code issues where if your space is bigger than this, it's going to be a different cost, Would it be possible for you to give us that report and say, hey, if you have an open space, this is the cost, the threshold is if it's under 1,000 square feet, then it's going to be this cost. I mean, are there that many options that you couldn't just give us the options? I mean, I'm just trying to understand the purpose of this.
So we have started, in fact, putting some ideas forward and some floor plans that just show, what building use might trigger certain code upgrades. For example, if the public would like to turn this upstairs back into a theater, that becomes an assembly space. Our structural engineer has been very clear that this floor will likely not support an assembly use at this time. So that's the sort of change that would trigger a full structural upgrade. So if we're looking at what we might do as soon as the library moves out to fill that space, it might not be, say, creating a large open multi-use space up here and moving all the offices downstairs. Those are the sorts of things that we're looking at. And I guess our thought was that we would come to a community workshop. We wouldn't be doing, just to clarify, we wouldn't be doing TikTok. We wouldn't be doing the community outreach piece, but we would be conducting the community workshop with the help of city staff.
So
And,
I guess my concern is that if we were to have this meeting and 10 people showed up, 20 people showed up, whatever it is, I don't know if that would be representative of the community. And I would hate to not follow a certain potential path because those 10 or 20 people went in one direction, not another. I would want the report that you're going to be bringing to us to have all the options so we can really have maybe 6 months of meetings or whatever we have to do to really get the entire community involved. And being that I don't want to limit that report, I'm questioning the value of the input for that purpose, not the value of community input, but at that stage. And might it be better for us to even start the process of getting the community involved in what do we want this building to be? Do we want, and because this is going to take a while, I think, to really get everybody involved and understand you know, our choices, and understand people's priorities. So I guess so I apologize for the long preamble to my question, but it's, if we don't want to limit our options, I'm having trouble seeing the value from that perspective of those types of meetings. And maybe you could explain to me what I'm missing.
Yeah, I mean, I'll let you talk in just a second, Elisa. The value that I see is having early engagement with the community. They have the option to come if they'd like, to have their voice heard, to have options written into the report where we could say potential future uses could include, and then we would have a series of options that could be considered as part of an initial programming or concept design phase that the city leads, and you'll have an idea of what some of those sort of high level, rough order of magnitude costs.
Got
might
it.
be.
So the answer is the public may come up with some ideas that you may not have thought about. And you're like, oh, maybe we'll have this here or this configuration. And your final report will be different because you heard that input. And therefore, that's kind of the value add that we're talking about. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I'd say.
That's accurate.
And-
You took the words out of my mouth. I think it's so important to let the community know that we value their input and to have them become engaged from the very beginning. So this is, we've said this several times, so I'm just, repeating what everyone else has said, but this is not intended to identify a specific use, but to, perhaps discover what uses, potentially could be viable for this building, and also understand what costs are associated with them, and bring that together with an understanding of the history of the building and being able to protect the building as a historic resource for Larkspur.
Okay, that makes
Yeah.
sense. Thank you for answering my questions.
and
Let me open up to council if anyone else has questions.
And I think I see it as important to be a source of education to the community about this building, because it's 110 something years old, so there's been multiple uses of it. And as we know by the regulations of what defines a historic structure, there have been changes that may have diminished its capacity to be recognized for some areas of it because it's been manipulated or modified, and it doesn't fit under the historic architecture classifications. And I think that's important information for people to have. And I don't know what that is because I haven't seen your report, but I've been reading a lot of these reports, and history has shown us that buildings evolve in many different ways, and communities evolve their use of them, and then the original integrity has been altered in some ways. And I think that's important information for people to learn about our history and to see how that actually, within the framework of an historic architecture analysis, can direct what are applicable future plans for it.
I just want to say thank you for saying that, because that's a lot of what you say is just so important. One thing that we find is that it's important to keep our historic buildings in use.
Yes.
They become more threatened when they are vacant. And so to be able to go ahead and do this historic structural report, allows us to plan ahead for when the building, is empty and maybe shorten that time.
Right. And also, I think it creates more vibrancy within a community when they learn their history. I mean, that's one thing that Larkspur is known for, history, past and present. But we used to have Mr. Cunningham do his report of the history of this building, jollification or something it was called. And I think that's just what makes Larkspur so desirable and so interesting to a lot of people, is that we do take the time to value that, and we take the time to educate ourselves about that, and also realize what the limitations are for that. Because I lived in a 1912 house before I moved here, and it has great bones, but it's missing a lot of other pieces that make for modern contemporary use possible. And all of that should be in a report that we can then dig deep into and figure out what's next. So
Well, I don't know if it's appropriate to say this at this point, but I agree with that. And what our hope would be is that we can move forward with the report, wrap it up, have a concise document, but have that moment of public input before we finalize it, so that you have something to start the next process with. You have pricing, you have a document that, that can be used as a planning guide for the future. It can be used as a reference for whatever happens next. And it doesn't the public engagement part is extremely important. And we think that one meeting with the public could be enough to finalize this
Okay.
report, to get some ideas moving forward. We aren't necessarily advocating the idea of having additional public engagement workshops at this point. We absolutely think those will be essential as you take the next steps.
Great.
So
Yeah.
Councilmember Paulson.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate you guys up there, and I just want to make two observations and ask a question. And I guess the first observation is we're not trying to decide the future of City Hall. We're really just trying to decide the value of phase one public input. And it looks like what the question centers on are two goals. One goal is engagement. And, we talked about that in various ways, but the other goal is option generation, which is, I think, at the heart of, the mayor's comments. And I'm wondering, my question then is if you can give examples or just a little bit more, because you're the experts on how, public input would help your option generation. Because I think, Councilmember Way's example of being a nurse is, look, I just do my history, my physical, and then I'll do the plan of treatment. And the question is, do you need to can the doctor do that alone, or does he have to have input from the patient? So I'm really trying to see from your experience, can you tell us specifically, like the children's library, how is public input going to change the option generation? I understand it'll help engagement.
I think that it'd be nice to hear from the community what needs there are in Larkspur and what different folks think that, might be useful and how they imagine the building could be used. So we can very, easily come up with, certain uses for the building that we understand would work. But we want to get that community input to make sure that we are also addressing what, folks around here feel like they need.
And do you think you already know that? Or you really think that you will learn something new if we do a workshop?
I'm eager to hear what the public has to say. We've had some charrettes in our office just to think about this and brainstorm ideas. And we wonder, is there an opportunity to have sort of a seniors center, a place where people can come and play cards and socialize? Could there be a little coffee kiosk in the front? Ideas for the future, not necessarily the next 5 years, but we understand that there will be some public programming spaces at the new library, and trying to think about, how this building could continue to have a public use, could continue to have public offices, host the city council and other commission hearings, but also maybe have more flexible use on that ground floor that could accommodate other public uses, other public meetings, other public gatherings.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Andre, any questions? No, we're good? Okay, we're good. Thank you. All right. So since we have closed public comment, I will bring it back to the dais. Conversation that you would like to have, discussion, debate. Anyone?
I think I like the comments that we heard from people. This is a long process. This is definitely not a decision making about what we're going to do with this space, because we don't have the data yet on what this space actually needs and what it has challenges and opportunities. So I think, as we heard from our historic architects, an additional public workshop, probably one in phase one, would give them valuable information. But I reserve the fact that I think we're going to need probably a lot of public workshops in phase two, but we're not there yet. So I think we're going to need to commit to a lot of public outreach as to what this space, once we have the information, can actually evolve into. So I would be supportive of having one additional workshop in phase one, and then adding additional ones if we can as we get the report and start phase two process. Would that fit into this option list that we were provided?
You're saying you would like us to bring back a budget amendment to add the $25,000 to add another?
You want
Public
one meeting
meeting.
or one extra meeting?
I mean, you already purchased one. So do you want 2 or 3?
We're already having a public workshop that was part of the
For
original
phase
contract.
one, correct.
Do you want to add
Okay, thank you for that,
more
because
to it?
No, I don't want to add one more to it. I want to
Okay.
keep the already
And
existing one
then
we've already
that's
framed.
the option of continuing with the contract as awarded.
Yes. Thank you for clarifying that. I looked down.
It's
to
a
read
little
that.
confusing. I
It is a
realize
little.
now.
Add,
And
because it says add one public workshop.
Yeah, that's on me. I'm sorry. about that.
Okay.
All right, so other council members have any thoughts they would like to share?
Thank you, everyone. It's been a great dialogue. And I would say normally I am in favor of saving money where we can. Definitely. That's, that strikes true to, my finance background. I would say in this instance, I think, as we just heard from Paige and Turnbull and the public, I think, it's valuable to engage the public, and we have to start engaging the public, I think. And it's beyond, the charrette, or whatever the public workshop ends up being, whether it's a charrette or some other format. I think, we really need to just start letting people know that this is coming. We're going to start talking about it. And that if people have ideas that, they should come and participate in these workshops. And I fully agree that we are going to have a lot of public engagement once the report is released with the cost estimate, and that, which will allow us to have a fuller dialogue with the public in terms of, what do we want to see happen in this building. But I do think that initially it would be good to get some ideas. I mean, my experience has been that, these ideas there are people in our community who they specialize in different things, and they have great ideas, and you just never know. And maybe we only have, 20 people who come to this workshop, but we could get some really good ideas. And so I'd be interested in seeing and hearing from the public, because the people who come will be the people who are really interested at this stage, and they may have some valuable feedback for us. So
I think we should add an additional.
no, I'm with you. I'm with you. I think we keep it one for now, but I think I also do like the advisory committee idea, so that as we move forward, I think it would be good to have a committee where we actually have that we can engage the public in multiple.
I think even like a public relations committee or, some committee that's in charge of engaging the public might make sense, but
TikTok channel.
Councilmember Paulson.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that's been said. I think, keeping the contract, and it's been very enlightening. It was a good question you asked, and I do think that, we shouldn't not do the one, workshop we have.
Yep, and I agree as well. I think the real value is going to be after we have the numbers and, our options. But I think it's worth the cost at this point to have the initial meeting and get some feedback. So having said that, can I get a motion?
Do we need a motion?
I'll make a motion.
No, we don't need
Or
one.
do we need, oh, we do not need a
You
motion.
should just say your directions to proceed as previously decided.
Mr. City Manager, our direction is to proceed as previously decided. Is that clear?
That's very clear.
All right, let's move on to the next business item. Business item 8.2 on one of these pieces of paper up here. There we go. Business item 8.2, consideration of a City of Larkspur traffic calming policy. And we get a staff report.
Good evening. So this next item is for consideration of a traffic calming policy. And first, just for those that may not know exactly what we're talking about with traffic calming, this is a definition that I pulled. But it's basically looking at measures on streets to curb some of the bad behaviors of vehicles and overall make the street better for all users. And so primarily what you're looking at is speeding traffic or excess volume cut through traffic, things like that. Typically, traffic calming is handled with three different methods. One is education, that's reaching out to neighborhoods, either with flyers or messaging and talking about good driving habits. Another is enforcement. This one is not a long-term measure, but for speeding or for turning where cars are not supposed to turn, things like that. You can do enforcement. And then finally, what most of the traffic calming lands in this last category, which is engineering. And this is, go back. This is split. I'll get into it later into level 1 and level 2, but the engineering measures, typically you're looking at starting out with doing striping and signing and things like that, all the way up to what most people think of when they hear the word traffic calming is traffic circles, speed humps, things like that. So looking at some of our neighbors, unincorporated Marin County doesn't have a traffic calming policy, but they do have a speed hump policy. The reason that we chose some of these neighbors is some of the requests we get for traffic calming are in areas where a street changes from Larkspur to county and back to Larkspur again. And so there are some streets over in the Greenbrae area that are unincorporated county that historically have had speed humps installed. So some of our residents are aware of speed humps. And so we did look at what Marin County does with traffic calming. And then town of San Anselmo, as you know, we share the same police authority. They did adopt a traffic calming policy in 2016. City of Mill Valley has a very similar traffic calming policy from 2012. Our immediate neighbors, Corte Madera, don't have an adopted policy, but they do refer to the county speed hump policy when they get traffic calming questions.
Julian, can I just ask you on that slide? I
Yep.
saw in today's Marin IJ that San Anselmo just did another traffic calming study to upgrade it. Do we know if they've accepted that, or they've just done a new updated study from 2016?
So
It's not in today's paper.
I don't know if they've done a new study. I think they've done, so their they haven't adopted their policy.
It's
that I know
it's a traffic safety study.
Oh,
Okay,
traffic
yeah,
safety study.
different.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I know it sounds similar, but
I know.
it's different.
Thanks.
Okay, so just the highlights of the Marin County policy. They only allow, and again, this is speed humps. This is not overall traffic calming for the county. They only allow them on local streets, and so there's different ratings of streets. And so a local street is primarily a residential street that has like less than 1,000 cars a day on it. And then you have evolutions beyond that, collector, and then arterial is the next, and then up to freeway highways. But they only allow them on local, like residential type streets. They require that 3 residents petition for a speed hump. Then they make an evaluation of what would be the affected area by the speed hump. And then they take a vote of the affected properties, and 2/3 of the property owners have to approve the speed hump. And then the neighborhood would be then responsible for the cost of the speed hump. Their policy says it's $2,600. I think that's kind of old. I think that number is quite a bit higher today. In addition to that, they have to do a couple of approvals. Their fire and police both have to approve the speed hump installation, and the speed hump has to be warranted by one of 3 measures. And so they do an engineering study where they look at the speed, they look at the number of accidents, and then if there's proximity to a school or a daycare facility, has to meet one of those triggers in order for it to be moved forward with, even if they have the 67%, it still needs to meet.
A couple quick questions before
Yes.
you move on. First of all, do the residents pay for those studies?
No, the preliminary work is undertaken by staff, but the actual cost of the installation is on the residents.
All right, and the 67% is an abstention and no vote, so you actually need 67% affirmative.
It's not clear, but the way it's written, I would take it to mean that it needs to be 67% in favor. It doesn't. The Mill Valley and the San Anselmo both speak to the percentage of votes received. The Marin County one does not.
Okay, and is it a similar percentage if you want the speed hump removed?
Yes.
Okay, and what happens hypothetically? You have somebody who's got a sports car, that every time they go over a speed hump, it scrapes the bottom of their car or something like that. Is there, is that too bad?
So California law has a concept called design immunity. And as long as the city does the installation of any of these types of traffic calming measures within parameters that have been sanctioned by the state as design specific, then we are immune from liability for damage caused.
Thank you.
So that's Marin County. And then this is the Mill Valley, San Anselmo, very similar policies. They have an overall traffic calming policy, not just a speed hump. They limit it to local streets. They do allow it on some collectors, but again, it has to be approved by fire and police. And they require a first step as education and enforcement. So before they even contemplate rolling out speed humps or anything like that, they require a 6-month engagement process with the neighborhoods. And their policies are attached to the staff report. So you can see some of the things. These include stickers that you can put on your trash cans that say slow down. They have yard signs people can put out. And then it's also talking with neighbors. And if it's still an issue after the neighborhood engagement and the education, then they move on to incremental engineering solutions. And this is where we get into the level 1, which is striping and signing. And level 2 is where you actually get into physical improvements. They require only 5 neighbors petition the city and say, we would like to look at traffic calming, to look at everything through level 1. Once you get to level 2, that's when you start talking about physical improvements in the street and we get into the actual voting and everything. But to start all these processes through the level 1, where we may implement some, or it's their policy where they may implement some striping and signing, it just requires that there's 5 neighbors in a neighborhood that would like to see some traffic calming measures undertaken. And so once they go through the education, enforcement, and they've done some level 1 and they've done some striping, and the neighbors generally think that the traffic calming is kind of working, but it's not enough and we want more, then they can petition to do level 2 improvements. And so for this, then this is where you need more than just the 5 neighbors. The city or the town decide on what the affected area would be of the traffic calming, and they require 50% of those property owners to say, we're interested in learning if traffic calming would work for us. If they get that 50% response, then they will move on and they will start looking at level 2 improvements. And they work with a property owner representative, fire and police, and a traffic engineer. And then they look at what the issues are, whether it's speeding or whether it's cut through, and they look at engineering solutions to those issues. And then they present what those solutions would be to those same neighbors again. And again, this is level 2. So this is, we're talking about narrowing streets with curbs, or we're talking about putting speed humps in or traffic circles based on the engineer's recommendation. And at that point, a vote is taken of those residents, and at least half of the residents have to reply, and 60% of the replies have to be positive for moving forward with the traffic calming. And then if it gets through that process, then the traffic calming plan is then taken to city council to adopt along with the engineering report that supports the traffic calming. And then they are implemented. Mill Valley and San Anselmo, their policies both talk about cost sharing, but it's not defined exactly as to what that means and what level of public participation in the cost is required, and what level of it comes out of a city budget. It just mentioned that there's a cost sharing to be discussed as part of the process.
So Julian, how do we decide, or how is it decided what defines the neighborhood? So let me give you an example. Let's say there's a lot of traffic that comes off of Magnolia, comes up William, all the way up William to Redwood High School. Where would be the defining limits of a neighborhood? Would it be on that whole thoroughfare, that whole road, or?
Not
it be?
necessarily. It would depend on the engineer would evaluate it and he would look at what the complaints are, what the conditions are. And then he would look at what the speeds on the street are, what the widths
Okay.
are, how many houses are there. You would do a whole evaluation
Okay,
and
so
then he
there's a
would
process.
determine what the area is. So it could be as small as a block.
Yeah.
Could really, the focus area could be as small as a block, or it could be 6 or 7 blocks, depending on what the traffic
So-
patterns are.
So kind of an example may be like when we did the parking permits, when the Larkspur Marina residents wanted the parking permits, it essentially was really congested for the area that's right at the entrance to the marina, and that was the highest impact area for parking needs. And it would be something like that where we would not just take that neighborhood as a whole, but more the impacted area. Okay. Got it. And a local street, would Magnolia be defined as a local street?
Magnolia
Is it
is either
corridor
a
street?
collector or an arterial. It splits at Doherty, and I believe north of Doherty, it's an arterial, and then south it is a collector.
I remember that when we did when we did the pavement studies, that there were differences between Magnolia and some of the smaller streets by their definition within not just within government code.
And Julian, a similar question, do you know, in Greenbrae, there are a number of streets that are used when Sir Francis Drake gets busy, whether it's, La Cuesta to, Los Cerros, or up around the hills. Are those all, streets that what level street, or I'm not sure how you define those?
Yeah, the only non-local street in the Greenberry Hills within the city of Larkspur is Via Hermosa, because it's an extension of, can't remember the name of the extension of it through the county, but that's a collector street in the county. And so the extension of it, it's only, Via Hermosa is a very short street. Pardon me? Bretano, that's it. Yeah, so Bretano in the county is a long collector that traverses Greenbrae, and it terminates in Via Hermosa. And so the section of Via Hermosa is technically a collector. None of the other streets in the Greenbrae Hills are collectors. They're all residential.
All right, and the streets that are partially owned by partially county and partially Larkspur, we would be able to have a policy and put in, what we feel is appropriate on our portion of those streets. Is that how that works? And if somebody wanted it in the county portion of those streets, they'd have to go to the county?
So we have worked in the past with the county in areas in Greenbrae, for example, on Via La Cumbre. Pre-COVID, a few years ago, we looked at some level 1 improvements. And because of the way the streets are oriented there and you go from city to county to city, we actually worked with the county engineering and let them know that we had concerns from the Via La Cumbre residents in Greenbrae and that we were looking at doing some traffic calming. And they took that information and then they looked at their immediate next closest street, which was Alicio. Because one of the issues with traffic calming is if you do it on one street, you may impact the other. And so even though we're not the same jurisdiction, if we have a street that's immediately adjacent, we would let them know we're considering this, and they may want to also consider how to countermeasure that. So as it turned out, when we did some level 1 striping on Via La Cumbre, the county also did level 1 striping on Alicio. We don't necessarily have to do it like that, but we try to work cooperatively together. If we're going to do traffic calming, and because overall the way the vehicle goes, the driver doesn't know whether they're going from city to county. And if an issue really spans the jurisdictions, then we should look at it collectively.
Fair, thank you.
And then the other thing I'll point out here is the Mill Valley and San Anselmo do not have warrants for traffic calming. So you remember when I showed you the county, they require that there's a documented speeding issue, or there's a documented accident history, or there's a proximity to the school. Mill Valley and San Anselmo don't have that requirement. They do have a ranking that's in their policy, but it's only for prioritizing requests that come in. Basically, if the neighborhood is asking for this improvement and the traffic engineer agrees with a solution, it doesn't necessarily have to meet an accident or a speed threshold. But that's information that we will still gather and share with the neighborhood, because if somebody's trying to decide if they are for speed humps or not, they may want to look at what the actual speed data is and the accident data. So we provide that, but there's not a threshold there that would trigger or negate traffic calming.
Julian, quick question. On the first steps where you talk about enforcement, I didn't see in the Mill Valley or San Anselmo plans, but where is it? Do we have, those cameras that will automatically issue a ticket if someone doesn't stop? Do we utilize that?
No, so the enforcement that we've used in the past is we'll start out with Central Marin Police, and we'll let them know that we've got speeding concerns. Typically, there's a number of different ways we'll do it, but they can put out stealth boxes that will capture data at various places, and then they can analyze that stealth data information to see what the speeds are, and from that they can determine if and where they should go out and do some spot enforcement. So we've done that a few times, but the enforcement for traffic calming is mostly about speed. It's not stop sign running and things like that.
Okay.
The state legislature recently authorized several jurisdictions to implement pilot programs to do automatic issuance of speeding tickets based on cameras. I don't know that any of them has been implemented yet, and we don't have any data yet, and we don't have any legal challenges to the tickets that have been issued as a result of them yet. You may remember, it may even be, I think it's actually, 15 years ago that a number of jurisdictions attempted to install red light cameras to automatically issue tickets for cars that were crossing against red lights. Most of those tickets ended up getting tossed out because they couldn't meet evidentiary standards that would hold up in the event of a challenge. So we have yet to see whether or not these new speeding program tickets will actually hold up.
And Sky, isn't there also a law stating that you have to publicize if you are going to have cameras enforcing?
I believe that's right.
Okay.
Can I just piggyback on that, since
Sure.
you have had some public comments suggesting we could do this with stop signs. You can't use cameras to issue tickets unless the legislature authorizes you to do that. And as the city attorney has said, they have a pilot program going on now for speeding tickets. The legislature has authorized red light tickets. There's an incredible amount of signage required and in order to do it. But they have not authorized stop signs. So I'm not aware of any jurisdiction in California that's tried to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Skinner.
All right, so the next couple of slides are going to show you what are the most typical level 2 installations. And so by level 2, we're talking about a physical change to the roadway that goes beyond just striping and narrowing, because people obviously can drive over stripes. So what you're looking at is reducing the actual traveled way. So on the left, you can see it was done in this neighborhood by installing a median in the middle of the roadway. And so typically as the road gets narrower, a driver will slow down to make sure they don't bump a wheel on a curb. And then on the right, this is the other means of a curb installation. This is called a bulb out. And this is where, rather than putting a new island in the middle, you extend the side of the road out towards the center of the road. In this particular location, they're showing it at a stop sign, but it's also effective where there is not a stop sign, because it really forces a car turning right to slow down, because it tightens the radius. You can't make a long sweeping turn. You really have to slow down to make that right turn. And so we have not installed any of these in Larkspur as traffic calming measures. These are also sometimes used as pedestrian crosswalk improvements. So in Larkspur, we have not installed any level 2. And part of the reason is because we don't have a traffic policy, so we don't have a mechanism to get to that point. And here's the other most common level 2 physical installation. This is an evolution of, historically, traffic calming was a speed bump. But speed bumps have evolved over the years, and they turned into speed humps, which are basically flatter and longer and do less vehicle damage. And they don't require you to slow down all the way to 5 miles an hour. The idea behind a speed hump is just to slow you down, to remind you that there's a speed limit on that street and you should be driving slower. It doesn't mean to slow you down to 5 miles an hour. In this case, these are actually speed cushions, which is another evolution of a speed hump. So a speed cushion is like a speed hump that has notches in it so that an emergency vehicle can fit between the humps and doesn't have to slow down as much or go up and over. And the reasoning behind that is not just that a speed hump for a fire truck going over slows them down, but it's also for ambulances that may have patients in the back and may have equipment. It's even if they slow all the way down to go over a hump, can be unsettling in the back of an ambulance. So the speed hump allows them to completely avoid that up and down movement if they have sensitive things going on in the back of an ambulance and they don't want pots and pans.
Would
flying
it
around.
also allow a car to completely avoid it?
It does
Or-
not allow a car, but anything with a similar wheelbase or wheel span to a fire truck. So potentially some of your
like a
FedEx
pickup truck or something like that?
Not. It's usually the bigger, like the utility trucks, like a FedEx or a UPS has a little bit of a wider. But most of your passenger vehicles and most of your light duty pickup trucks will have to hit at least one bump. They can always get one tire in a channel, but the other one will be on one side of the hump cushion. And so we talked a little mostly about the advantages of traffic calming and why people ask for it. There are documents out there that have shown that physical traffic calming does lower the speeds of traffic in the vicinity of the device. It can reduce traffic volumes. We didn't talk a lot about, focus mainly on curb installations and traffic humps, but there are other traffic calming level 2 measures that were in the report, such as turn restrictions. So you'll notice that throughout town, we have some signs that say no left turn from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. To eliminate cut through traffic or to eliminate people getting queued up behind vehicles who want to turn left in busy hours. And so it can also reduce traffic volumes. If you have enough speed humps on a street, the idea is you will dissuade drivers who don't need to be on that street, who are using it as cut through, from going on that street. Now, the downside to that is everybody else who lives on the street still has to go over all of those speed humps. So there's a trade-off. You install enough of them that it makes it annoying for somebody and they don't cut through your street anymore, but it's also going to be annoying to you, driving home, especially if you have coffee in your hand or, something like that. Traffic calming can improve conditions for other users. So if you slow the cars down, it can also be beneficial to pedestrians and bicycles that are sharing the road. And it can also reduce enforcement needs if you put a mechanism out there that forces people to drive the speed limit. Disadvantages. So there is, as I've mentioned, a documented emergency vehicle response impact if you have a physical traffic calming measure on a street. And there's different reports that have different values, and you'll hear 3 seconds, you'll hear 7 seconds, depending on which study you read. But there is definitely there is an emergency vehicle adaptation to that hump or measure in the street. In addition to emergency response, it can also hinder orderly evacuations if there's a mass evacuation needed for some reason from a neighborhood, and not so much for speed humps, but if you put chokers in to narrow the vehicle lanes and you put islands in, then you're forcing maybe one, lane of traffic out of a neighborhood. Whereas if you didn't have those restrictions and you were trying to do a mass evacuation, you may be able to get more people out of the neighborhood quicker. Talked about this too. They can result in removal requests. What I hear from other folks who have installed traffic calming devices is the level or the volume of calls doesn't necessarily go down, but instead of people calling you to install traffic humps, you now have people calling you to remove traffic humps. So that can happen. And as we mentioned, there's also the potential for diversion to neighboring streets. So part of the engineering analysis and looking at whether it's appropriate to install traffic calming on a street is going to look at what impact is that going to have? Is it going to push everybody onto the next street over? And do we have to then look at an issue on the next street over? It can increase vehicle noise. This is two parts, either slowing down or accelerating before and after. But also the vehicle suspension can make a noise as it goes up and over a speed hump. And then driver discomfort. So this is not a measure that targets the bad behavior. This measure targets everybody. Everybody has to go over the speed hump, or everybody has to go through the restricted. So yes, it addresses the person that's trying to go 10 miles above the speed limit, but also the person that drives the speed limit or just under is going to have the same inconvenience of going over the speed hump. Aesthetics, they're not terribly attractive. They're usually highlighted so that people can see them. So while they're typically black, they're going to have either yellow or white markings on them to draw attention to them so that a driver knows to slow down. And then usually they will have an advanced warning sign, which is black on yellow that says bump or even bump ahead if it's the only one on the street. Because the idea is you want somebody to slow down for the hump. So you want to give them the warning. You don't want anybody hitting a speed hump at 10 miles an hour over the speed limit. Maintenance, this is a little bit lower of an issue, but once you start putting things on the street, there are sewer pipes and gas pipes under the street, and we do from time to time have to repave and restripe a street. And so the speed hump would have to be removed and replaced at an additional cost if any of those situations were to occur. And then a lot of the traffic calming, other than signs that restrict traffic completely, have localized benefits. And so what this means is if you have a speed hump, somebody's going to slow down and they're going to go over the speed hump at 15 miles an hour. That person might get annoyed and say, I'm going to now drive 30 miles an hour till I get to the next speed hump because I just had to slow down for this. And I still want to get to the end of the street in my usual 2 minutes or whatever. So that can happen. And then I mentioned as a positive that they can be beneficial to bicycles and pedestrians. They can at times be an obstruction to cyclists. Especially the speed cushions. If a cyclist wants to get out and not go over the hump and they move out and it puts them in traffic where they ordinarily wouldn't be. That last one is typically we can mitigate that with good engineering, but it is something in addition to potential loss of parking on a street that as part of the engineering design, we would look to minimize those. So that's kind of the preamble and the overview of what other agencies are doing. And so, as I mentioned, we do have some neighborhoods in town that from time to time do contact us, and we've worked with them through some of those early steps, but we haven't got to any level 2 improvements with any of the neighborhoods. And we feel now that traffic's getting back to where it was pre-COVID. Some of those requests are ramping up again. And we feel that it would be help with transparency and uniformity moving forward if we had a council adopted policy that we could share with those folks that we could move forward with. So I have a series of questions that we'd like some feedback on and get your direction on whether to return with a policy or not.
Before we hand it over for the questions, I just wanted to make sure that council's aware. It's Mr. Skinner's practice, it's been his predecessor's practice to work collaboratively with Chief Norton and his staff. And for all intents and purposes, we've been following most of what you've heard exists in these other communities, particularly the Mill Valley, San Anselmo approach. We've just been doing it informally. And one of the things we get kind of stuck is with the disagreements start in the neighborhood and we'd have no boundaries or guidelines or policy about what constitutes sufficient consensus to move forward. And so that would be a benefit in my mind of having a policy, would be to put some guardrails and some definition around what sort of community support is necessary to do this sort of implementation.
All right, thank you, Mr. Skinner. Thank you, Mr. City Manager. What I think I'd like to do is I'd like to just go to public comment if that's okay, only because it's getting late. So let's start with people in the audience here. Is there anyone who would like to comment on this issue? Come on up.
Yes, Council, Eric Torney here, via Lagoon resident, Marin County native. Julian's been working in the neighborhood since he got here. He did a walk on the street with about 20 neighbors, all the whole length, one way and back. And then the next thing that was put up were some signs at the ends of various sections. Via La Cumbre is a long street with a lot of sections. And it was to advise people it's not a through street and no trucks. And he did striping and all those things. They had a kind of an initial benefit, but I think if you ask Julian, he's done some studies and they had an initial effect, but they've kind of gone back to what they were. And as time evolves, the capability of vehicles and the attitude of drivers has changed, and it has probably even exceeded what they were originally. So I think Julian's put together a really nice report here. And the only thing he didn't mention that is something that I recently discovered and observed is a thing called a speed table. And it's like a really elongated speed bump where it has a level section that is at least the length of the vehicle that it's trying to control. So the vehicle doesn't bump up and down, it bumps up, it levels off, then it drops down. So it doesn't have that initial shock that a speed hump or speed bump or speed cushion has. And they're very effective. I've got videos that show them, I've got several I could show you, but I don't think this is the appropriate time. At any rate, the speed humps and the speed tables don't take away parking, where some of the other things that Julian mentioned, the built curbs and the bump outs, they could be useful, but we would have to be evaluated exactly where they are. And I guess the last thing I would want to say is on Via La Cumbre particularly, there's different zones and each one has a different problem. Like the lower section, which if you're familiar with the street, it starts off level, it goes up a steep hill and then levels off again. And that maybe is 40 houses. And then it's divided. And so there's a divided section. I don't know how many houses there are on it. I think Julian tells me there's 119 for the whole street. So there's that initial short section. And then there's a really long section, which has a whole lot of houses, but it's divided. And then there's finally one at the very end, which is very narrow and it has a lot of curves. And in that part of the street, there's been, I think, several side swipes where the vehicles have been hit that are parked. And so there really needs to be different solutions for the different parts of the street, where the lower part of Via La Cumbre is wide, and that's where the people are really speeding fast. I mean, that's where I live, and I can hear cars, screeching around the corner from Elysia onto Via La Cumbre, and very rare, but then you hear them hit the gas, and they're going at least over 60. It's not all of them, but it's some, and it doesn't take but one person to really cause a whole lot of trouble. I don't know if Julian's stealth cameras have that information on there, but it'd have to be a pretty random that one of these really radically speeding cars that I think they call it road rage. And I don't know, the only thing that can really stop something like that is a built improvement. And I think it's going to be a speed table, because the speed humps are going to cause a lot of the problems that Julian mentioned about neighbors and inconvenience, where the speed table, like they put them in at San Francisco Airport in front of all the arrival terminals to keep the taxis and people from going. And they do put crosswalks right at them. And there's one in England that I have a video here that I could show you, but like I said, it's not the time. It shows buses coming up, and it's designed so the bus, you can hear it roaring down the street. It comes to the speed hump, it just goes over it. And like my video in 30 seconds has 4 buses going across it. So it's done in very, different places. So I think we need to have some policy that allows Julian to study and evaluate those different kinds of control measures.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your comments. Appreciate it.
I think you speak really well to the fact that a policy will allow a toolbox of options in it.
Yeah, I think that's what the purpose of this
Yeah.
meeting is about. It's not to decide what to do, but
Right.
Exactly.
to give Julian some tools to work
Right.
with and give the city attorney the ability to communicate with the various
Yeah.
adjacent jurisdictions and the different agencies.
And you gave a good example of one street that could use possibly 2 or 3 different techniques,
Right.
perhaps that engineering wise would accomplish a lot of things rather than just one particular option. So thank
Right.
you. And I did see you did send in a letter, so that's great.
Yes, yes. Well, I did also want to add that the dividing the street into different neighborhoods is going to be very important because the people on the lower section will have certain needs and the upper people won't like it. So the way that it's going to have to be divided is the people in each neighborhood have to do that. I think San Francisco has a policy that does that where it's neighborhood specific and they can even decide to close the street off if they want.
All right. Well,
All right.
thank you for your comments. I want to make sure I give everybody a chance to talk.
It's
so
my
thank you.
pleasure.
Mr. City Manager.
I did forget, and I think Julian forgot, so I wanted to emphasize, it's in the staff report, but for the benefit of folks who are listening and maybe didn't get to read the report, the Central Fire Department command staff is reviewing policies that have been adopted by other fire agencies with specifications of which types of traffic calming measures will work to address the issues that Julian was talking about making sure an ambulance can still travel safely and that it won't impair a fire engine. So a companion piece to this is that the chief's intention is to create a policy that he'll take to the fire council. We've let our colleagues in Corte Madera know that that's going to happen because it may ultimately lead to some community discussion in their community about what they might want to do. But I think we should have emphasized that because it is an important piece. They've historically been very concerned about speed bumps, for example, is something they don't want for that passenger transport issue that was discussed.
Okay, thank you for that. Other public comments from people in the room? 4 times a charm.
Trees in the center of.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're coming on the storm, you might as well make the best of it. James Holmes, Larkspur, there's an old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I think that applies to the situation here. And I think the 3rd paragraph of the staff report just sums it up so well. It says, to date, the city has installed moderate traffic calming measures, including signing and striping at various locations. The city does not have an adopted traffic calming policy, but employs well-established practices consistent with many local jurisdictions in California. That makes sense. Requests are investigated individually by the city engineer who judges whether requests are merited, and there is neighborhood support to bring an installation to city council for approval. That seems to me precisely the kind of a situation needed in the street described. And the last and key sentence here, the city has not installed any physical traffic calming measures such as speed humps, as no neighborhood has reached consensus in the desire for the improvements in the judgment of the city engineer. Well, I think that's a key point. There is really not a lot of consensus for that. And I think that I don't think that, I think you should not open the door to this kind of controversy, gratuitous controversy. I mean, in the list, I mean, there's 10 reasons not to have them and 4 reasons to have them. I personally think that there's an equity reason too. I mean, folks like myself who have older cars, the speed humps are just terrible on the suspension. But in any event, I don't think you should open that can of worms by trying to speculate for all intents and purposes, like a theological discussion, what is appropriate for a traffic calm. Rather, it is best to address it on a case-by-case basis as they currently are. So I think things are going fairly well as they are, and I would encourage you to continue that process and definitely not open the traffic whatever you call it, can of worms. And finally, I can't help but think that having a more complicated policy, particularly one like the county, which has lots of bureaucratic policies, I think that's going to be more expensive in the long run. I realize that the staff report says it will be cost neutral because maybe requests can be handled more efficiently. But in any event, it would be cost neutral not to have one, and trying to decide a priori what the appropriate consensus is. I think that really is a very difficult thing to do across the board. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Other people in the room that have comments on this issue? Seeing none, let's go online. Anybody online have comments on this issue?
Looking for any raised hands from our Zoom audience members. And the first comment will come from Terrell.
Hi, everyone. Terrell Kellaway. I'm the Executive Director for Marin County Bicycle Coalition and also the Vice Mayor for the town of San Anselmo. I think I know most of you. Sorry, I wanted to come today, but I don't have a wetsuit. I love that you're looking at ways to slow drivers down, but I'm very concerned that you're using my town's traffic calming policy as an example. If you look at some of the meetings that we've held about our traffic calming policy in the last 2 years, we've really asked them to kind of throw it out for various reasons. When speeds are high, people die. We've all seen the charts. If you're walking or biking and you're hit by a car going 20 miles an hour, you're 90% likely to survive. If you're hit going 30 miles an hour, just 10 miles more an hour, which is the speed that a lot of people travel on our arterials and connector streets, you only have a 50% chance of surviving. In my opinion, the San Anselmo policy was created as a way to minimize requests for traffic calming by making the process so onerous that no one would succeed. If you look at the council meetings from September 12th of 2023 and February 13th of 24, you'll see the discussions where the council basically decided to deprioritize the policy and held up, as an example, various items. One is that the policy is 10 years old and a lot has changed in that time. 2 is that it would be a full-time job for someone to complete the 19 steps required to have an impact. And then 3, probably most importantly, is that it deprioritizes engineering and really prioritizes education and enforcement. The National Highway Safety Administration rates different tactics for efficacy and saving lives. And they say that education and enforcement both get 1 star out of 5, whereas engineering gets 5 stars for effectiveness. And when you talk about response times, most of the calls that EMTs get are traffic crashes. So if you can slow traffic down, you're not going to have as many of them. And that's just a fact of life. In September 23, community members asked for traffic calming in their streets in one of the streets in San Anselmo. And we worked with the fire department to come up with solutions that didn't impact response time. We've since installed 4 speed cushions that the fire department agreed would be fine. And the speed has since gone down by 10 miles an hour. And that is probably saving lives at this point. If they had followed the guidelines in the policy that you used as an example, this group would probably be still trying to get their needs met. Fortunately, the way it's laid out, the policy, as it was described tonight, is not really how things are turning out in practice. We have a fantastic public works director, and he really is attentive to community needs, and he realizes that the council is really eager to make our streets safer, and we've made that a priority. In February 2024, we abandoned our traffic calming policies and created a $50,000 a year fund that would be committed to to installing 1 to 3 traffic calming projects a year. At first, addressing a backlog of need that there are 8 projects already in the hopper that we need to address. But then once we get through those, we're going to start an RFP process. And that's a lot more proactive rather than reactive. And it also is more equitable because it's not just relying on people who are available to come to meetings and, you know, not working to come to meetings and talk to their council, but it is a lot more community responsive. The Mill Valley policy is kind of the same as San Anselmo's formal policy. The county process is a little bit different. It's not quite as onerous as the education and outreach side of things, but it does require 2/3 of residents to support it after reading a very questionable list of pros and cons. And then it requires people to pay for the speed humps themselves. And I really recommend that every town in Marin County consider creating an active transportation fund, which is what we've done in San Anselmo. Part of our road tax is now going to active transportation, and we've created guidelines that make sure that that those are not being spent on things like sharrows, but are being spent on things like traffic calming and real things that are going to keep our vulnerable users safe on the streets. So if you want safer streets, I suggest not following these outdated and counterproductive policies, but look to an RFP process like the one we discussed in council at the February 13th meeting. You can see that recording. It's also another really great example is the city of Petaluma, which recently, a couple years ago, implemented a proactive traffic calming process, and it has really dramatically reduced speeds and serious injuries across the city. And I keep hearing from people how much better it is to walk and bike in Petaluma.
So I'm going to ask you to wrap it up because we're trying to
I'm
keep it 3
done.
minutes. All right?
Thank you for your time. So thank you for letting me go a little over.
Hey, thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay.
Okay, other public comment?
Looking for any additional raised hands from our Zoom audience members? And there's no further public comment.
Okay, I will close public comment. Because it is late, I get punchy when it gets late, so I am going to read my thoughts and let everybody disagree at will. And fight me if you want to, or turn the car around. Question 1. Should the city of Larkspur develop and adopt a traffic calming policy? I believe we should. Anybody agree or disagree?
I would support that, and I also support that we have an excellent public works department that will not just cookie cutter take a document from a neighboring city, and will have used their expertise to make sure it's refined for Larkspur and Greenbrae. So some of the concerns that were just recently expressed by the previous caller, that the document in San Anselmo may be outdated, I am confident that we will be getting the state-of-the-art document with our public works.
Okay, other council members have a comment on that?
No, I agree. I think a policy
support it.
would. help.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next question. Should physical traffic calming, example, speed humps, be allowed subject to engineering and emergency services review and approval and neighborhood support? I think that they should. And I will go through my criteria in a second, but that's my base is that yes, we should. Anybody disagree with that?
Well, I think they fall under the toolkit. I mean,
Correct.
that's one of the examples. It's not a given that
Correct.
every
It's not the
neighborhood's
only
gonna-
one, but it's one of
yeah.
them. Okay.
It's one, if you read the other reports, there's a dozen different techniques that can be applied based on what the example given of the road surface and what the needs are. So if one of them is speed humps or speed tables, that should be in the toolkit.
Okay, I think we're on the same page. Anybody not on that page? Hearing none. Let me go through what I think the ideas are. First, I heard initiated by a certain number of people. I would pick 7. That was one of the things I've heard. Does anybody like a different number for the number of people to initiate this?
Are you talking about number 3 now? Are you on number 3?
Well, no. So
No.
the criteria for, I mean, we have to give staff direction right now. So
But-
the question is, if somebody wants to install a speed hump, how many people do they need in order to begin the
But
process?
I don't think that's a decision we make outside of having a professional who's the Public Works Director with traffic engineers, who will come up with the parameters of what works in our community for how many. And I personally don't think that's a decision that we make right
All
now.
right, let me put that over to staff. Is staff looking for the specificity of
If it's 5, 7,
instruction
20.
from us, or do you want us to come back to you and say, "Hey, you guys pick a number and, we'll debate your number that you pick"?
So we're looking for direction from you. There's a couple of different triggers, and the policies that we shared with you have a couple of different ones. The county specifically, as you mentioned, said that 7 people, and then it gave a percentage of 67 have to approve. The Mill Valley and San Anselmo say 5 people need to initiate, and then 50% need to say, yes, let's look into it further. And then 60% of at least 50% need to say yes. So there's a number of,
So my
depending on what
question,
the step is.
my question is, how much specificity would you like from us? Would you like us to say whether we would like it to be 5 people or 7 people, or would you like us to say it should be a number of people and you pick the number because that's your job?
So I think for clarity for working with these neighborhoods, it would be good to have a number that I can reference, and I can say, please go get 4 of your neighbors. But at the same time, there may be some unique characteristics about a certain neighborhood where that doesn't make sense. So you could give a number, but subject to the city engineer's discretion if there's something unusual about a neighborhood where that number doesn't make sense.
I give the number 7, subject to the
Please.
city's, go ahead, Dan.
Sounds good, Mr.
7, subject to the city's discretion if that's not appropriate for a particular situation. And again, this is just to give them direction so they can come back with something, and we can always,
We can
talk
always.
about that point.
Let me just jump in
Sure.
here. I mean, I'm a little uncomfortable with this specificity. I think, I was saying earlier, I referenced TAM, being on the transportation, the real goal here to me is safety.
Mhm.
Traffic calming is not an aesthetic. It's not about, reaching a certain meditative state. It's about saving lives. And the parametrics report that TAM put together in January says that in this county, not on 101, but on arterials and collectors, 10 people are killed a year. And in Larkspur, and we know what's going on, there's 70 road segments and there are 93 intersections, and Larkspur has 4 of those. So we kind of know where this is going on. And then an interesting part of the grid too is like, why are people killed? We're unusual, like for San Anselmo, dark conditions is a contributor, rear end collisions. The only thing in Larkspur that really kills is unsafe speed. So I want to come back to the point of why we're doing this. And I think, this is, again, my perspective. And I think it would be good to have the general guidance that we're not looking for a process that's building consensus where everyone's happy with the speed bump, like we're building a park and do we put a fountain in the middle? This is about saving lives.
Right, but hang on. So, but the reality is, this is most affecting people who live on the streets where you are considering, or what we're talking about here. They should be the people who, have the decision-making ability to say whether they want it in their neighborhood or not. I think we're all about safety, but what I am hearing is there are people who feel like they're in an unsafe situation. They're on one of these streets, people zip by, they try to talk to the city about it. The city doesn't have a structured policy, so it takes a lot longer than it might otherwise. I'm trying to streamline that so we can basically say, okay, if you feel that you're on one of these streets and you want to do something and your neighbors are on board, then let's find an easy way for you to do that. And the easy way you got to come forward, you got to have a certain number of people to pass the threshold. It can't be one person says, "Hey, I want a speed bump," right? They got to have a certain number of people to pass the threshold, right? It's got to be a street that qualifies. Can't be somebody that lives on Sir Francis Drake and goes, "I want a speed bump." It's got to be on one of these side streets, right? And there's got to be you need consensus from a certain number of the people that are living on that street. Right. And so these are the things I think that we're here to decide right now. And we could either punt it and say, hey, city staff, why don't you guys come up with the numbers based on the other jurisdictions and tell us what you think. Or we
What's the
can,
matter with that? I
there's,
mean,
there's nothing wrong with that. They're both, but the point is, we are the people representing the city right now. So we can say,
So-
hey, this is our thoughts. Or we could say, staff, you come up with it. I'm
I
happy with
get your
either.
point, and to probably distill it down, there needs to be some level of community buy-in of a neighborhood, whether it be 5, 7, 10, 20. I don't know if we're qualified to bring up what number that is, but I would like to give direction that there needs to be a community buy-in process and a certain number of residents that are affected to participate in this petition process, and have Julian come back to us with what his.
I'm fine with it. The only reason I'm saying this is because 5 minutes ago, we just asked Julian, would you like us to punt it to you, or would you like us to give you a number? And he said, give me a number. So I'm trying to give him a number. If you say, no, Julian, we're not going to give you a number, fine. I mean, I just.
What do you want to do?
I would encourage you to follow the mayor's lead and pick a number, and here's why. Or at least give us direction to craft something with the percentages like the San Anselmo policy. I think if we take a step back, when data tell us that we need to do traffic calming, we do it. Our best example is South Alicia. It wasn't popular with a lot of residents, but we did a lot of traffic calming on South Alicia because we had data tell us we needed to do that. I in no way am making this next comment to disparage any resident who's concerned about traffic calming, but most requests for traffic calming that we receive that this policy is about are not backed up by the standards of data that are used in our world by the professionals. When we go out and do the measures for speed, we don't see enough to trigger installation of traffic calming. That doesn't mean it doesn't occur, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't feel real to people who are there all the time. We're not there all the time, but when we go out and measure it, it doesn't meet our thresholds. We always, when we hear that there's a traffic calming problem, we ask the police for their data. We have never asked the police for data and said, are there a lot of accidents? And they say yes. And then we go, oh, but we're not going to do anything about it. When we call and ask, we find out, well, there aren't a bunch of accidents, or there's not a lot of reported accidents. You know, Councilmember Paulson and I had this discussion. Probably stuff going on that doesn't get reported, so it's not in our data. But that's why I think you need to give us direction to have a policy that empowers folks who perceive a problem we don't perceive by data, because that's where this issue really lies.
And again, I don't care about the number. I just think staff wants us to give them a number. So I'm fine with 5. I'm fine with 7.
7.
Does anyone have a preference?
Yeah, and I appreciate the distinction. I mean, I think you addressed what I was trying to say is I just wanted to, give my perspective of why we're here, but there is a second layer, which is we have to, address when the public comes to us and wants us to be responsive. And I think a coherent and standardized process is great. So 7.
7 it is. Okay.
I'll even
next.
illustrate it really quickly, if I may, one more time. I would think William is the best example. I guarantee if we go to data collection, it won't meet our thresholds. But twice a day, there's a problem on William, right? Twice a day, the residents who live there perceive a real problem. And I don't disagree with them because of the nature of who those drivers are. And I recently had one of those, so I get it totally. But it doesn't usually click past our data problem. So that's the best example. This neighborhood wants you to set some parameters so they can engage us.
Okay. All right. So we got 7. The next question is this just for local streets, which I believe it should be? Again, you don't want somebody on Sir Francis Drake saying, I want a speed bump.
Yeah.
I would say on local streets only, subject to the discretion of staff if they find that there's a street that's an exception, but it still would be safe and everything like that.
And this might be a little bit, out of scope, but I do think the bicycle path should be included. I think that, the pedestrians and the elderly and the, people on safe routes to school, particularly with e-bikes, I don't know if that fits into the parameters of this discussion, but
Bike paths, so we should add them. I think that's a whole different thing.
that I don't know if that would fit into this at all, but if it's, having some kind of calming or something.
Yeah, so we are looking at some possible signage and possible ways to remind folks there actually is a speed limit on a bike trail. That question I got asked at the beginning about design immunity. I don't think there's a whole lot of really good design immunity for putting speed humps on bike trails. So I'd want to be
let's-
cautious before we get too far down that path.
Right. I agree that there are bicycles who speed. I think it's a longer conversation and we need a little more data,
Yeah,
for that.
that's a different
So
policy.
I think if we want to put that on a future agenda, I would be comfortable with that. But for this,
I think a future conversation about strategizing how to make our bike paths safer is a great conversation.
Okay.
That you could tell the mayor to lead in 2025.
More trees in the center of the road. Like Patrol Canyon.
all right. Next question, it's, clearly has to be approved by fire and police. I don't think
Yeah.
there's any question about that. The next question is I just wrote them down. No, so the next question I have is what percentage of the relevant neighborhood would need to approve it? I would like it to be an affirmative percentage. I don't want people who are on vacation to not, have their, somehow not be included in this. I would imagine somewhere between 60 and 70% is the numbers that we've been hearing. I'm completely open to anyone's opinions or discussions about what that exact number should be. I'm happy for any of those.
Well, this is where the last caller where, I feel like that's where this process may have gotten bogged down in the trying to rally or get the neighbors to all vote and pay attention to what's happening here. I mean, I think, maybe it's 7 people to initiate the conversation. And then I think it's important that we lay out the criteria, as the city manager was saying, is what is our threshold for considering or evaluating this stuff? Or evaluating the request. And, it could be to, Councilmember Paulson and Way's points, it's about safety. And so if 5 people vote for it, I mean, is it a safety reason? If the data tells us that there's a real safety reason for this, why would we not want to?
Well, okay, no, but so hang on. So
Yeah.
if there's a safety reason,
Mhm.
the city's going to do it regardless of what the neighborhood
Right.
thinks. Well, these are situations where the city doesn't perceive,
Mhm.
based on their data, it's a safety thing, but the people who live there
Uh-huh.
say, listen, we live here,
Mhm.
we are experiencing something,
Uh-huh.
we as a neighborhood would like to fix it.
Uh-huh.
And the question is, what percentage of we, the neighborhood, should have to give a thumbs up to put a speed hump in? Because there are going to be some people who like I said, to drive a sports car and it's a low car. It's like,
Yeah.
I don't want a speed hump, but
So would we be consistent with what we just passed with the Larkspur Marina, where they're gonna tax themselves and they require within their legislation 67%?
that's
Would we-
between
would
60 and
we-
70. I'd
would
be fine
we
with
be
that.
consistent that way, or
2/3, perfect.
2/3?
number.
Yeah,
Great.
and because we've done that just recently with another decision making. And then the other question is, when we've passed an ordinance regarding parking permits within a neighborhood, did we set a parameter of
Mm.
how many people within that neighborhood had to approve? Because we did it for,
But I don't remember.
I just want to remain consistent. If we decided for that type of a parking vehicle issue,
Can we take that into account when we come back?
yeah, I mean, because
Well,
we,
let's say 2/3, unless council reads unless staff reads another policy that we have and feels that we should be consistent.
We can work with
a
that.
vehicle
Mhm.
policy,
right.
I mean, that's.
We can work with that.
Yeah.
direction.
And I think we have Heather Gardens has come forward and Larkspur Marina with parking policies, so.
All right. So next question on the list here is what level of neighborhood support should be required? That's one we just talked about.
Mhm.
Who should pay for the traffic calming installation? I don't really have an opinion on that. I mean, I think, people pay taxes, it's probably part of our job, but again, I don't know if people on one side of town want to use their taxes for streets that they never drive on. So there's an argument for both ways.
Well, I mean, we could think of it this way. We've passed 2 tax measures to enhance our road surfaces and our road pavement surfaces. Maybe, I don't know if it fits within that legislation, that because these are actually road improvements.
So as a reminder, those taxes are general taxes.
Right.
So everything technically fits in them. You did set road maintenance and repair as a major
And emergency.
direction. So in line with this speaker from San Anselmo, you might want, as part of your budget process, to allocate a certain amount every year to be available
For
to-
traffic,
to
yeah.
do these installations.
Yeah, because I mean, I think this is if we decide this, as to Gabe's point, this is really a public safety issue for the health and safety of community, then I think it's an expectation that the city within our public works budget pays for these improvements. And we have means to do that through some of our road maintenance budget from those tax measures, because speaking of an equity issue, there may be neighborhoods where this is an additional expense to a community and to a family that can't afford it, but they want to have a safe neighborhood. And so I think we should pay for it.
Yeah, and I think the idea of using Measure B is great, that money. And then, you know, speaking of hurdles, if you get through the hurdle of 67%, you know, then to say you still have to fork up the money is never going to happen. So I think that kind of makes it equitable for me.
Do you disagree?
No, I agree with the funding. I think
Okay,
that- yeah.
we're all on the same page. So those are all the things on my list. Turning it over to staff, are there any questions about this issue that we did not answer for you or give you sufficient direction?
On my end, I think I'm good.
I think I'm good too. We will go get to work.
Can I throw one more out there? I just want, since we do have a number of streets, for instance, this gentleman that have borderlines with other jurisdictions, I think I would just encourage that we try to have consistency if possible within that traffic flow area if our road leads into another jurisdiction. If we can figure out how to do that so that we maximize the enhancement of safety.
Yeah, that would be part of the engineering analysis if we got to that level. Yeah.
And with that, I will close business item 8.2, moving on to item 9, which is my last time using this?
Wow, well, you'll open the next meeting.
Okay. Second last. Meeting is adjourned.